The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been considered the world's premier law enforcement agency for a century since its founding. It has grown into many different areas since its inception. The first director of the FBI was also its longest-serving, spanning almost 5 decades under 8 presidents, and he was instrumental in creating an effective, all-encompassing yet sometimes controversial organization. The FBI has since lost much of its luster, mired in corruption since the Obama administration and now the Biden administration, polluted with partisan political acolytes working under an equally corrupt Department of Justice. How did the FBI start out? Why was it created? Who was the real J. Edgar Hoover? How did he remain in charge for so long?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, military veteran, historian, author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
John Edgar Hoover was born on January 1, 1895 in Washington, D.C., without a birth certificate being filed, although it was required in 1895. 2 of his siblings did have certificates, but Hoover's was only filed in 1938. Hoover attended Central High School and had, after graduating, landed a job in the Library of Congress, where he learned proper organization and indexing of books, which would serve him well later. He graduated from George Washington University Law School with a bachelor's degree in law in 1916, and a year later earned an LLM in 1917, when he was hired by the Justice Department to work for the War Emergency Division on July 27, 1917, which paid him $990 a year, which would equate into $23,500 in 2024 dollars, which exempted him from the draft. Hoover began his questionable career when he became the head of the Alien Enemy Bureau, which was authorized by President Woodrow Wilson as the USA entered World War I. Hoover had the authority to investigate, question, arrest, and incarcerate any allegedly disloyal forwarders without trial. See our video on Woodrow Wilson. Hoover then received additional authority from the 1917 Espionage Act, where the Bureau arrested 98 suspicious Germans living in the U.S. without due process, and also listed another 1,172 as worthy of arrest out of a total of 1,400. In 1919, Hoover took over the General Intelligence Division, which was known as the Radical Division, as they sought out communist and domestic threats, and Hoover started his threat list of those he deemed to be subversive. In 1920, Hoover became a Freemason at D.C.'s Federal Lodge No. 1 in Washington, D.C., and then joined the Scottish Rite, becoming a 33rd degree Mason and Inspector General Honorary in 1955. President Calvin Coolidge appointed Hoover as the 5th director of the newly created Bureau of Investigation in 1924, and he immediately fired all female employees and forbid hiring women in the future. Hoover later restructured the organization, created later, and he renamed it the FBI, which we know today, in June 1935. Hoover recruited intelligent and well-educated men to be agents as he expanded the FBI into a world-class crime-fighting agency. Unlike most organizations, Hoover accepted and sought out new technology, introducing many innovative methods such as the centralized fingerprint data file, the mugshot collection of known criminals, and introduced the new forensic science and specialized laboratories. Hoover also created the National Blacklist, also known as the FBI Index, and he created the 10 Most Wanted list for nationally known criminals. Hoover was also a jealous egomaniac who fired agents regularly or reassigned them to end their careers. The highest profile target of his erratic and unprofessional approach was when he forced Agent Melvin Purvis out of the FBI. Purvis, ironically, was the most successful agent in FBI history at busting up crime rings and arresting major criminals such as the Mafia and bootleggers, and his fame rose, outshining Hoover. Much of the success attributed to Purvis and his team were the captures or killing of major bank robbers, such as Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, and other household names of the day, including Pretty Boy Floyd, Alvin Karpis, Babyface Nelson, and Machine Gun Kelly. Ironically, Hoover always denied the existence of organized crime, preferring to focus upon communists, despite the fratricidal wars being fought by the mafia families during Prohibition. It was widely believed that gangsters Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello were in possession of embarrassing photographs of Hoover in women's clothes and in compromising intimate situations with his young protege, future FBI Deputy Director Clyde Tolson. I had the privilege of knowing and working with a woman named Kathy Lockhart. His brother was the bodyguard and driver for Meyer Lansky, and she told me this firsthand, that it was well known that Meyer Lansky had photographs of these two men in very intimate circumstances. During the 1940s, it was rumored that Hoover, who was seen by some of his agents in women's clothing and lived with his mother into his early 40s, was homosexual. Historians John Stewart Cox and Ethan G. Theoharis speculated that Clyde Tolson, who became an assistant director to Hoover in his mid-40s and became his primary heir, had a sexual relationship with Hoover until the latter's death. It was also believed that Costello controlled Hoover, who was addicted to gambling, by providing him horse racing tips, with their mutual friend, gossip columnist Walter Winchell being the courier. Hoover was well known to send his special agents to place $100 bets for him at the racetracks. Gambling and homosexuality would have been strong blackmail material. Author Anthony Summers, the author of Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover, quoted Louis Rosenstiel's fourth wife, Susan, as claiming to have seen Hoover engaging in cross-dressing in the 1950s at all-male parties at the Plaza Hotel with her husband, Louis Rosenstiel, attorney Roy Cohn, and young male prostitutes. Another Hoover biographer, Burton Hirsch, later corroborated the story. In the FBI, it was apparently an open secret. Clint Murchison Sr., a loyal LBJ supporter and owner of the Del Charro Hotel in La Jolla, California, often threw parties of a questionable kind. Hoover and Tolson also frequented the Del Charro Hotel. Summers quoted a source named Charles Krebs as saying, "On 3 occasions that I knew about, maybe 4 boys were driven down to La Jolla at Hoover's request." Summers stated that Hoover often frequented New York City Stork Club. Louisa Stewart, a model who was 18 or 19 at the time, told Summers that she had seen Hoover holding hands with Tolson as they all rode in a limo uptown to the Cotton Club in 1936. Summers also claimed that Hoover was friends with Billy Byers Jr., an alleged child pornographer, pedophile, and producer of the film The Genesis Children, which was also blackmail material to keep Hoover in check. It may be more true that Hoover was in fact bisexual, as he had relationships with actress Dorothy Lamour in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and Layla Rogers, the mother of actress Ginger Rogers. However, there is a contrary viewpoint, such as biographer Kenneth Ackerman, who says that Summers' accusations have been widely debunked by historians, but he can't provide sources to counter the allegations, whereas eyewitnesses support the previous theory. Journalist Liz Smith wrote that Cohn himself told her about Hoover's rumored transvestism long before it became common gossip. One source who is often overlooked is actress and singer Ethel Merman, who was a longtime friend of Hoover's since 1938, and she was very familiar with all the parties during his alleged romance of Layla Rogers. In a 1978 interview, and in response to Anita Bryant's anti-gay campaign at the time, she said, Some of my best friends are homosexual. Everybody knew about J. Edgar Hoover, but he was the best chief the FBI ever had. Hoover's private life notwithstanding, he was a dedicated anti-communist. Even before the USA entered World War II, Hoover was still focused on communists, but due to the threat of German espionage and later sabotage at East Coast ports, the FBI created a special department to handle those threats. During World War II, many things happened, such as the Quirin Affair, as German U-boats landed small groups of saboteurs in Florida and on Long Island to cause acts of sabotage. Both teams were apprehended after one of the anti-Nazi German agents contacted the FBI and told them everything. However, Hoover had to make it look like he and the FBI solved the case without any assistance, and the German who became an informant was also charged and convicted of espionage without any recognition. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, by the way, see our videos on him, was also fearful of foreign espionage and gave Hoover the authority to bug and wiretap at will without the necessary warrants. The U.S. Attorney General at the time, Robert H. Jackson, let Hoover decide on how and when to use wiretaps, but he found the whole business quite distasteful, not to mention illegal and a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Hoover would continue using illegal methods for the next 3 decades. Hoover was also responsible for working with local law enforcement on arresting the mafia bosses who became too high profile. The greatest of these was Lucky Luciano. See our video on him. As the war dragged on, Luciano was approached by naval intelligence with FBI support to recruit Sicilian and Italian henchmen to join the Office of Strategic Services to work as pathfinders in Sicily and Italy prior to those invasions. Despite the Soviets being an ally during the war, Hoover actively spied on suspected communists in the U.S., working also with MI5 in the United Kingdom. Even before the war, he worked on the Verona Project. Hoover knew that he had a gold mine, and he kept the decoded wiretaps and listening device intercepts as well as information from code breaking, which were the greatest counterintelligence secrets, in a locked safe in his office. He decided not to inform President Harry S. Truman, Attorney General J. Howard McGrath, or the Secretaries of State Dean Acheson and General George Marshall when they were in office. He did, however, inform the Central Intelligence Agency of the Verona Project and all the tapes and broken codes in 1952. Truman and Hoover did not get along. After Truman denied the FBI the privilege of becoming a global intelligence service, Truman wanted the FBI to focus upon domestic intelligence and crime and not conflict with the CIA. Harry Truman said that Hoover transformed the FBI into his private secret police force, stating, "We want no Gestapo or secret police. The FBI is tending in that direction. They are dabbling in sex life scandals and plain blackmail. J. Edgar Hoover would give his right eye to take over, and all congressmen and senators are afraid of him." One point of contention was in 1946 when Attorney General Tom C. Clark authorized Hoover to compile a list of potentially disloyal Americans who might be detained during a wartime national emergency. In June 1950, as the Korean War started, Hoover submitted a plan to President Truman to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, much like Lincoln during the Civil War, and detain 12,000 Americans suspected of disloyalty. Truman, who was never a fan of FDR's internment of American citizens based upon race, was not very receptive to the concept. However, despite his many years of denial, after the famed Appalachian meeting of the crime bosses in 1957, which was recorded by the FBI, Hoover was finally forced to admit that there was in fact a national crime syndicate. Due to public knowledge and outcry, Hoover created the Top Hoodlum program and began going after the top crime bosses, but selectively. Hoover was also not very fond of the U.S. Supreme Court's decision that people could not be investigated due to their political affiliations. So, thwarted by the SCOTUS, Hoover, never one to let the U.S. Constitution and federal law get in the way, created COINTELPRO, an acronym for Counterintelligence Program. At first, COINTELPRO targeted the Communist Party, and Hoover ordered the observation, surveillance, wiretaps of any American he suspected of communist sympathies. This included many celebrities, such as actors Sterling Hayden, Gene Seberg, and Charlie Chaplin. Hoover's new methods included infiltration, burglaries, setting up illegal wiretaps, planting forged documents, and spreading false rumors about key members of target organizations. There was also credible evidence that Hoover authorized the inciting of violence and arranging murders. Hoover was detested by civil rights leader T.R.M. Howard of Mount Bayou, Mississippi, and the feeling was mutual. Howard had criticized the FBI's failure to investigate thoroughly the racially motivated murders of George W. Lee, Lamar Smith, and Emmett Till, alluding to Hoover being a Klan supporter. Hoover wrote an open letter to the press singling out these statements as irresponsible. In 1963, Hoover ordered a halt to the federal investigation into the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing by the Ku Klux Klan that killed 4 black girls. By May 1965, local investigators and the FBI had identified 4 suspects in the bombing, supported by witnesses, and this information was relayed to Hoover. However, ironically, no prosecutions were pursued, even though the evidence was reportedly, quote, so strong that even a white Alabama jury would convict. And also, in a strange turn of events, Hoover told his investigators not to share their findings regarding the bombing with local law enforcement, and he sealed the files. He tended to pick and choose the cases he wanted his agents working on depending upon political expediency. Hoover used his own Gestapo methods against many people, including both John F. and Robert F. Kennedy, 2 men he loathed, mainly because they would not allow him unfettered authority. It became known that Hoover had illegally bugged Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., actually bugging the hotel rooms where King would entertain white prostitutes and have wild sex parties, which were recorded. King was subsequently harassed incessantly, and in 1964 he received an anonymous blackmail letter stating that there was only one thing left for you to do, which King interpreted as an exhortation for him to commit suicide. But others were targeted as well, such as Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, John Lennon, Muhammad Ali, and members of the Black Panthers, just to name a few. In 1965, white civil rights worker Viola Liuzzo was murdered when Ku Klux Klansmen chased her car after noticing that her passenger was a young black man. See our video on the Ku Klux Klan. They fired shots into her car, and Klansman Gary Thomas Rowe was a known FBI informant. The FBI then spread rumors that Liuzzo was a member of the Communist Party and had abandoned her children to have sexual relationships with African Americans involved in the civil rights movement. FBI records do show that Hoover personally handed the accusations to President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had a public image of supporting civil rights. Again, see our video on Johnson as well. COINTELPRO finally came to an abrupt end in 1971 after its illegal operations came to light following a burglary at the FBI office in Medea, Pennsylvania. The condemnation was furious, and the U.S. Senate Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church, Democrat from Idaho, investigated the FBI in 1975. It was formerly known as the United States Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities. The committee clearly established that COINTELPRO's activities were illegal and violated the Constitution. In essence, Hoover broke the law. Regarding J. Edgar Hoover's collection of audio tapes and illegal surveillance, biographer Kenneth Ackerman wrote that the allegation that Hoover's secret files kept presidents from firing him is a myth. However, Richard Nixon was recorded in 1971 as stating that one of the reasons he would not fire Hoover was that he was afraid of Hoover's reprisals against him. Apparently, Hoover kept files on everyone. Hoover was an American version of Reinhard Heydrich, who kept files on everyone in the Third Reich, including his bosses Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler. This would explain why Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson never fired him. The Kennedy files were known to be explosive regarding JFK's numerous affairs, along with his brother Robert. But here is something of great interest. The FBI led the investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and in 1964, just days before Hoover testified before the Warren Commission, President Johnson waived the then mandatory U.S. government service retirement age of 70. This allowed Hoover to remain as the FBI director for an indefinite period of time. Many critics consider this to be a quid pro quo, as Hoover and the FBI were criticized for not doing a proper investigation. Later in life and after his death, Hoover became a controversial figure as evidence of his secretive abuses of power began to surface. He was also found to have routinely violated both the FBI's own policies and the very laws which the FBI was charged with enforcing, and to have collected evidence using illegal surveillance, wiretapping, and burglaries. However, Hoover consequently amassed a great deal of power and was able to intimidate and threaten political figures, including high-ranking ones. In essence, he had created and ruled over his own medieval fiefdom for decades with little to no oversight. Hoover left a legacy that is still felt today. Because Hoover's actions came to be seen as abuses of power, FBI directors are now limited to one 10-year term, subject to extension by the United States Senate. As we have seen with the current Department of Justice and the FBI, as well as other federal agencies, corruption is always part of the plan depending upon who is in office. Hoover was the last Grand Master to wield unlimited power regardless of who was president. J. Edgar Hoover died of a heart attack on May 2, 1972, and his role was assumed by Associate Director Clyde Tolson, his alleged lover. But on May 3, 1972, Nixon appointed L. Patrick Gray of the Justice Department, with no experience in the FBI, as acting director, with W. Mark Felt becoming associate director. Nixon was cleaning house. Apparently, the legacy of J. Edgar Hoover was over.
Miami, 1986. The sun is already high, baking the pavement. Palm trees sway. Convertibles roll past with the tops down. Bikinis, neon colors, gold chains. Loud music bleeding out of open car windows. This is Miami at its peak. Flashy, hot, and alive. Tourists crowd the beaches. Locals move slow, used to the heat. It feels like nothing bad could happen here. But just a few blocks away from the ocean, agents are hunting hardened criminals. Unmarked cars drift through quiet neighborhoods. Windows cracked, radios low. 8 federal agents are on surveillance, watching for 2 violent bank robbers. They're not chasing a headline, and they're not expecting a war. And then, metal slams into metal. 2 cars collide at an intersection. Doors fly open. Gunfire erupts instantly. Not warning shots. Not hesitation. This is execution-level violence in the middle of suburbia. Within seconds, FBI agents are hit. Blood soaks into light-colored shirts. A man, who should already be dead, keeps advancing, firing with terrifying calm. Meanwhile, the beach is still full. The music still playing loudly, oblivious to the ensuing chaos. But here, on the street, in under 5 minutes, the FBI will lose control of the situation, lose agents, and lose the illusion that badges and training are enough. This wasn't just a shootout. It's the moment that American law enforcement realizes they were never ready for what was coming. So what happened that day in April of 1986? What was the FBI Miami Shootout? Let's try to find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History.
beginning of the toughest 26 days in Marine Corps history.
With confidence in our armed forces.
The 36th President of the United States died this afternoon.
Tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
Long before the gunfire in Miami and before the FBI put him under surveillance, Michael Platt and William Maddox were already drifting towards violence. Not suddenly, but step by step. Michael Lee Platt joined the U.S. Army in early of 1981, during a period when the military was rebuilding itself after Vietnam. He was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And that mattered. The 82nd Airborne doesn't treat soldiers to hesitate. They train them to move forward under pressure, to function when adrenaline is high, and to keep fighting when logic says stop. Platt completed airborne school, qualifying as a paratrooper. He trained with rifles, pistols, and squad-level tactics. He learned discipline and aggression, and how to operate as part of a combat force. But by 1984, problems had surfaced. Platt was identified as having ongoing issues with superiors. He struggled inside a command structure, not because he couldn't handle stress, but because he couldn't submit. The Army eventually discharged him for failure to adapt to military life. The phrase sounds clinical, but its meaning is blunt. It means a soldier who can do the job, but won't follow orders, won't accept authority, and won't stay inside the system. And when Platt was discharged, the Army didn't remove the training he was given, it just removed the restraints. Now, with no mission, hierarchy, or external control, Platt's discipline fractured, but his aggression remained. Platt didn't struggle the way many veterans do. Instead, he became fixated. Weapons, preparation, control. He trained himself relentlessly, practiced marksmanship, modified firearms, studied how to move, how to fight, and how to dominate a confrontation. Platt didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a man preparing for a hostile, unfair world. William Russell Maddox also served in the U.S. Army, earlier than Platt during the Vietnam era. But Maddox struggled after leaving the military. Where Platt became disciplined and focused, Maddox became volatile and reckless. He bounced through civilian life with no anchor. His criminal record included robbery, weapons offenses, and violent behavior. Maddox wasn't methodical. He was angry. He needed direction. He needed someone to take the lead. And eventually, he found that in Platt. Platt and Maddox met in South Florida in 1984. Not through the military, but through criminal circles. Guns brought them together. Violence kept them together. Platt recognized something useful in Maddox, a man willing to pull the trigger without hesitation. And Maddox recognized something stabilizing in Platt, a leader with a plan. The roles locked in quickly. Platt planned, prepared, decided, and Maddox followed. Together, they didn't just commit crimes, they escalated them. By 1985, Platt and Maddox were deep into a string of armed robberies across South Florida. They targeted banks and armored cars, including Barnett Bank branches and Wells Fargo armored vehicles, striking in daylight, in the public, where resistance was likely. Platt and Maddox carried out more than a dozen armed robberies, stealing over $200,000. But they didn't rush in blind. They scouted locations in advance, watched guard routines, timed police response windows, and planned escape routes before even pulling a trigger. They carried long guns, not just pistols. Platt favored a Ruger Mini 14 rifle, firing high-velocity 5.56 rounds, while Maddox backed him with additional firearms. This wasn't just intimidation. It was firepower meant to overwhelm. And when things went wrong, they didn't break contact. In December of 1985, during a robbery in Miami, Platt shot and killed Frank J. O'Brien, an unarmed man who attempted to intervene. In other encounters, they fired directly at police officers to escape, showing no hesitation, no panic, and no attempt to disengage. Witnesses didn't describe chaos, they described calm. They described Platt moving deliberately, issuing commands, advancing under fire, reloading without urgency. This wasn't desperation, it was controlled violence. Platt and Maddox didn't expect to get away forever. They expected gunfire, but they were ready for it. Platt often wore body armor during the crimes. But what made Platt truly dangerous wasn't his weapons, it was his mindset. He no longer believed in surrender. He no longer believed in consequences. Platt had crossed the line where survival mattered less than dominance. He accepted death as long as he took others with him, and Maddox followed him there. By the spring of 1986, the FBI knew these men were violent. They knew they were armed, and knew they stole over $200,000 and had already killed. What they didn't understand was what they were dealing with, adversaries who had already decided how the story would end. Because when criminals expect arrest, police have options. When criminals expect war, there are only casualties. Miami area police and county deputies had investigated multiple armed robberies linked to the pair, but repeated encounters failed to stop them. The criminals crossed city and county lines, struck in different jurisdictions, and escaped before coordinated responses could form. The crimes escalated beyond routine police work. There were bank and armored car hits, federal crimes by definition, involving federally insured banks and interstate commerce, so the responsibility then shifted to the FBI. By early 1986, the FBI had a file on Platt and Maddox. Photos, witness statements, ballistics, then a growing list of violent robberies. On paper, the assessment seemed straightforward. 2 armed bank robbers with prior military service. High risk, but manageable. That framing was the first mistake. The Bureau understood what Platt and Maddox had done, but it did not fully understand how they thought. Platt's military background was noted, but not deeply interrogated. It was treated as a resume item, not a psychological warning. Useful in context, but not decisive. What went largely unexamined was why Platt no longer wore the uniform. His inability to function inside the command structure. That trait matters, because law enforcement encounters are built on an assumption that authority, presence, and escalation will eventually produce compliance. But Platt did not believe in compliance. He did not respect hierarchy. He did not defer to badges. And he had already demonstrated that he would shoot first rather than submit. To Platt, law enforcement wasn't authority. It was opposition. The FBI planned surveillance operations with speed, but not depth. Agents were briefed quickly. They expected to spot the suspects, coordinate a stop, and make arrests. This was not a SWAT operation, not a barricade scenario. It was treated as a rolling surveillance that might turn into a takedown. Most agents carry revolvers or semi-automatic pistols, limited spare ammunition, and minimal body armor by modern standards. Only had a few access to shotguns. No one was expecting rifle-level resistance. The unspoken assumption was simple. If confronted, the suspects would flee. If cornered, they would surrender. If they fought, it would be brief. And that assumption was a failure of doctrine. And on the morning of April 11th, 1986, when surveillance suddenly turned into contact, there would be no time left to adjust. The FBI agents were conducting mobile surveillance, following the suspect's dark Monte Carlo through residential streets, waiting for the right moment to make a stop. And just before noon, that moment arrived. Several FBI vehicles moved in, attempting to box the suspect's car and force it to a halt, but Platt did not slow down. He turned the wheel and deliberately rammed one of the FBI cars. The impact spun vehicles across the intersection. Another car slammed in, metal folded, glass shattered. The stop instantly collapsed into chaos. Before most of the agents could fully exit their vehicles, gunfire erupted. Platt was out of the car and firing within seconds. No warning, no pause. He was hit early. A 9mm round struck his arm, entering his chest and damaging vital tissue. That wound should have ended the fight, but it did not. Platt stayed on his feet, kept advancing. He kept firing. Maddox was also hit, struck in the head. He collapsed inside the vehicle, appearing incapacitated. So Platt continued alone. Armed with his Mini 14 rifle, he fired rounds through car doors and windshields. The FBI vehicles offered little protection. Agents, armed mostly with handguns, were outmatched in range and penetration. Agents returned fire from behind engines, doors, and curbs. Several were hit while trying to move or reload. Others were trapped inside disabled cars. Despite being mortally wounded, Platt maneuvered through the scene with purpose. He flanked positions. He closed the distance. At close range, he shot and killed 2 agents who were already wounded and unable to escape. Only after multiple additional gunshot wounds at point-blank range did Platt finally collapse. The firing finally stopped. In less than 5 minutes, the fight was over. Sirens closed in from every direction. Police secured the area. Medics moved between bodies and vehicles. Some agents were already gone. Others were bleeding out in the streets. The reality set in quickly and brutally. 2 FBI agents were dead. 5 more were wounded, several with injuries that would end their careers. The suspects were also dead, but that offered no relief. Because this had not been a close call. It had been a collapse. And within hours, the Bureau began its internal reckoning. Weapons were examined. Ammunition was collected. Radio logs were reviewed frame by frame. And one fact kept surfacing. Platt had been mortally wounded early in the fight. The bullet had reached his chest. It had done catastrophic damage, but it had stopped just short of his heart. That failure mattered, because Platt had remained fully functional long enough to kill again. The question inside the FBI was no longer whether the agents had fought bravely. They had. The question was whether the Bureau had sent them into a fight they could not win. Quietly, conclusions formed. Handguns were inadequate against rifle-armed adversaries. Existing ammunition standards were insufficient, and training had not prepared agents for sustained gunfights. None of this was announced publicly.
The fact that he was killed, he obviously has taken on some violent undertakings, and this, of course, brought our interest back to him.
There was no conference admitting failure, no institutional apology. The Bureau did what institutions often do. It went silent, but behind closed doors, everything changed. The FBI began testing its ammunition in ways it never had done before. Not just for accuracy, but for penetration. They tested performance through glass, metal, and bone. They tested what happens after barriers. They tested whether a bullet could still do its job when everything went wrong. The results were sobering. Many rounds that had performed well on paper failed in real conditions. Velocity dropped too fast. Penetration was inconsistent. Stopping power was assumed, not proven. The Bureau rewrote its standards from the ground up. Out of Miami came modern terminal ballistics testing and new handgun calibers. Miami came with a shift in mindset. law enforcement could no longer assume compliance. They had to plan for resistance and sometimes for war. And those changes did not stay inside the FBI. Police departments across the country followed. Weapons changed. Training changed. The image of policing changed. What happened in Miami became the justification for heavier arms and different tactics. Whether that made America safer is still debated, but one thing is not. Every modern law enforcement officer carries the legacy of that gunfight, because after Miami, no one could pretend anymore. A badge alone would not stop a rifle. The FBI didn't lose because of hesitation or fear. The agents fought back immediately and aggressively. They lost because they were outgunned. Every modern traffic stop, every patrol rifle, every piece of body armor traces back to that morning in Miami. The question is, how many times that lesson had to be written in blood before anyone was willing to listen?
Nothing is more terrible than a battle won, except a battle lost. It was a terrible battle to win, but we lost so much.
Let us know your thoughts on the 1986 Miami Shootout in the comments below.
For 11 days in August 1992, the country stood in amazement as they watched nonstop coverage of federal government agencies, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the U.S. Marshal Service, and Federal Bureau of Investigation, with local law enforcement surround a small cabin and a standoff in the mountains of Idaho. When it was over, 3 people would be dead, and a government-fed media spin machine went into hyperdrive to try and make sense of what had happened at a place called Ruby Ridge. Who was Randy Weaver? Why was he targeted by the federal government and the Justice Department? What really happened at Ruby Ridge? Why was the federal government held liable for its actions?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Randy Weaver was one of 4 children born to Clarence and Wilma Weaver, a farming couple in Villisca, Iowa, on January 3, 1948. The family grew up as devout Christians and had some difficulty finding a denomination that matched their views, so they often moved around amongst evangelical, Presbyterian, and Baptist churches. After graduating from Jefferson High School in 1966, Weaver attended Iowa Central Community College for 2 years. In 1968, he dropped out to enlist in the United States Army during the height of the Vietnam War. He was stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where he attended the Demolitions Combat Engineer course conducted by the Special Forces, and he was discharged in 1971, having never served in Vietnam or seen combat. Randy Weaver and Vicki Jordison married in a ceremony at the First Congregationalist Church in Fort Dodge, Iowa, in November 1971. Weaver dropped out after 1 semester while attending the University of Northern Iowa after he landed a well-paying job at the nearby John Deere tractor factory. His wife Vicki worked first as a secretary and then as a homemaker. Vicki Weaver was a firm believer in the apocalypse factor and wanted the family to move away from Maine society, so they purchased a 20-acre property in remote Boundary County, Idaho for $5,000 in 1983 and built a cabin. They also believed that interracial marriages were an affront and held strong Christian identity beliefs, believing that Jews were impostors and white Protestants are the true descendants of Israel. Weaver also sought a life of solitude and became a self-proclaimed separatist from the federal government. Weaver testified about his racial beliefs before a U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in 1995, saying, "I am not a hateful racist as most people understand it, but I believe in the separation of races. We wanted to be separate from the rest of the world, to live in a remote area, to give our children a good place to grow up." Weaver became friends with many members of the Aryan nations, though he never joined the group, he was often a visitor at their compound in Hayden Lake, Idaho in the late 1980s. Aryan nations were already on the federal government's watch list, much like the Ku Klux Klan before it was destroyed in courts and by lawsuits. In 1988, Weaver decided to run for county sheriff using the slogan, "Get out of jail free," and he was a believer that Americans should not pay federal taxes. Weaver then had a property dispute with a neighbor who went to the Boundary County Sheriff and gave a statement, saying that Weaver had made verbal violent threats against President Ronald Reagan and the governor of Idaho, among others. This eventually led to the Secret Service interviewing Weaver, something he was very unhappy about and made him even more reclusive and angry at the government. In 1989, Weaver met undercover ATF agent Kenneth Fadley, who used the alias Gus Macusano, at a meeting of the white supremacist group Aryan Nations. According to the government, after a friendship of 3 years, Weaver agreed to sell Fadley 2 sawed-off shotguns and was recorded on tape saying he could supply Fadley with 4 or 5 illegal shotguns a week. It was a trap. In December 1990, Weaver received felony weapons charges in connection with the 1989 transaction. During this period, the Weaver family relocated from a house they were renting into another cabin near Ruby Ridge, Idaho, in the Selkirk Mountains. In January 1991, 3 federal agents posed as stranded motorists near Weaver's home and, with the county sheriff, arrested him and brought him in for arraignment when he approached to offer assistance. Weaver's court date was set for February 19, 1991, and he was released on bond. The court date would later be rescheduled for February 20th, 1991 instead. However, a letter sent to Weaver by a probation officer mistakenly listed the date as March 20, 1991, which meant that Weaver never received the accurate court date. The feds then told Weaver that the gun charges would go away if he became an informant against the Aryan nations. Already distrusting of the government, Weaver refused the deal and informed the Aryan nations. Vicki Weaver was incensed and wrote to U.S. Attorney Maurice O. Ellsworth, addressing him as servant of the Queen of Babylon, and she wrote, "The stink of your lawless government has reached heaven, the abode of Yahweh, our Yahshua, and whether we live or whether we die, we will not bow to your evil commandments." She also wrote letters to law enforcement and any government agencies threatening violence if they trespassed on their property or take any action against the family. She was particularly concerned about the authority figures who might come and try to take her children. Weaver had made it clear that he had a 300-yard radius kill zone around his property, and anyone within sight ignoring the no trespassing signs around his home without his permission would be fired upon. While he never actually attacked anyone like this, he was very open about it and apparently serious. Not long afterward, on August 21, 1992, deputies of the United States Marshal Service arrived to arrest Weaver under a bench warrant for failure to appear on the firearms charge, thus beginning the 11-day standoff. A key point was that Weaver was never asked to surrender. He stayed inside the cabin with his family and friend Kevin Harris. Due to the suspicion that there could be persons held hostage inside the cabin, Federal Bureau of Investigation hostage rescue team was brought in. At the time of the Ruby Ridge Siege, the Weavers had 4 children, Sarah 16, Samuel 14, Rachel 10, and Elisheba 10 months old. Vicki homeschooled the children. The situation grew even more tense as the national, then worldwide media became aware of the situation, and the Attorney General was under pressure to conclude the situation quickly. While doing a reconnaissance of the property, 6 of the marshals encountered Harris and young Sam Weaver in the woods near the cabin. A shootout then took place, and as to who fired first became a great controversy. The marshals shot, and Art Roderick killed the Weaver's dog Striker, then shot again, and there was confusion on who shot young Sam Weaver in the back as he ran away, killing him. During the firefight, Harris returned fire and shot Deputy U.S. Marshal William Francis Deegan in the chest, killing him. Then, on August 22, 1992, FBI sniper observers with the hostage rescue team arrived at Ruby Ridge. They were issued with their special rules of engagement, allowing them to shoot any armed adult male exiting the cabin. That day, FBI sniper Lon Horiyuchi was concealed 200 yards from the cabin. Horiyuchi fired when he believed Weaver and Harris were preparing to shoot at an FBI helicopter. The first shot hit Randy Weaver in the arm. Horiyuchi fired a second shot meant for Harris as the men ran back into the cabin. The bullet struck 43-year-old Vicki Weaver in the face while she held her infant daughter behind the front door of the cabin and also injured Harris. Vicki Weaver died soon after, but her body remained in the cabin for 11 days. Horiyuchi later claimed that he never knew she was there, but a sketch he doodled on hotel stationery the day after the shooting appeared to show that he was aware there was another person near the door. The next day, the HRT, unaware that they had killed Vicki Weaver the previous day, asked via megaphone on the third morning what she, meaning Vicki, and the kids had for breakfast in a way that came off as completely ghoulish to the Weaver family, who thought the HRT knew what they had done. The FBI and marshals brought in Green Beret war hero Bo Greitz as a negotiator. His efforts convinced Weaver to allow Harris to receive medical attention, and he was subsequently arrested on August 30th. Greitz also convinced Randy Weaver and his 3 daughters to surrender also, which they did the next day. Weaver was charged with 10 major crimes, including murder for the death of the Deputy U.S. Marshal Deegan, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to violate federal firearms laws, assault, etc. A total of 10 counts. Famed cowboy attorney Jerry Spence was Weaver's defense attorney, and he successfully argued that Weaver's actions were justifiable as self-defense. Spence did not call any witnesses for the defense, rather focusing on attacking the credibility of FBI agents and forensic technicians. The judge in the case later dismissed 2 counts after hearing prosecution witness testimony, which was conflicting on the events, as well as the fact that it came to light that Weaver had been approached by ATF agent Kenneth Fadley, who asked Weaver to supply the shotguns. That was entrapment, and the charges associated with that event the judge had set aside. Critics said that the very strict rules of engagement were altered during the Ruby Ridge siege, relaxed to the point to force FBI snipers to shoot unarmed adults. Larry Potts, demoted from the Bureau's number 2 position, and 4 other FBI officials were suspended pending a criminal investigation into whether they covered up evidence that the deadly force rules were changed during the siege. Weaver was found guilty of the 1 count failure to appear, for which he was fined $10,000 and sentenced to 18 months in prison, but he was credited with time served, having awaited trial for 14 months in jail plus an additional 3 months, and he was then released. His friend, Kevin Harris, was acquitted of all criminal charges. The legal fallout from public pressure was like an avalanche, mainly because it was an election year. An inquiry by the Justice Department criticized the FBI for failing to gather sufficient intelligence and for not ordering the residents of the cabin to surrender before engaging them in a firefight. It also concluded that Horiyuchi's second shot was unconstitutional because Harris and Weaver were running for cover and could not be considered imminent threats, and both men were unarmed at the time. The inquiry further alleged that Horiyuchi unnecessarily endangered others by firing at the door of the cabin, but the U.S. Attorney General decided that there would be no criminal charges against Horiyuchi. However, local prosecutors in Boundary County, Idaho, charged Horiyuchi with involuntary manslaughter. The case was moved to a federal district court, which dismissed the charges against Horiyuchi on the grounds that he was immune from prosecution because he was acting in his official capacity. An appeals court affirmed the district court's ruling, but a second en banc or fuller complement of judges panel reversed that decision and required that Horiyuchi stand trial. Before a third, larger en banc panel could be convened to consider that decision, the state of Idaho announced that it was dropping charges, and all 3 earlier rulings were vacated. These events also led to some demotions and suspensions of various people in the FBI, including HRT Commander Richard Rogers, who was also in command at Waco. But no charges were filed against anyone in the government except Lon Horiyuchi for manslaughter, and those charges were eventually dropped after several years of legal wrangling back and forth. The event at Ruby Ridge became a global news story and a clarion call to millions who believed that the federal government was exercising too much power without enough constitutional oversight, especially where the Second Amendment was concerned. Weaver was interviewed by New York Times reporter Ken Fusen in 1995, where he expressed his regret about not appearing in court for his 1991 gun charge, saying, "I'm not totally without fault in this." In August 1995, the U.S. government, in order to avoid a highly publicized trial on the civil lawsuit filed by the Weavers, settled out of court and awarding the 3 surviving daughters $1 million each and Randy Weaver $100,000 over the deaths of Sammy and Vicki Weaver. His family eventually received a total of $3.1 million in compensation for the killing of his wife and son by federal agents. In 1998, Weaver published his own book, titled The Federal Siege at Ruby Ridge, in our own words, where he toured gun shows and sold autographed books. In 1999, he married legal secretary Linda Gross in Jefferson, Iowa. Apparently, the event at Ruby Ridge had altered Weaver's outlook on many things. On June 18, 2007, Weaver participated in a press conference with tax protesters Edward and Elaine Brown on the front porch of their home in Plainfield, New Hampshire. He told the assembled group, quote, "I ain't afraid of dying no more. I'm curious about the afterlife. And I'm an atheist." The story became a major part of the anti-government political landscape and popular entertainment. A CBS miniseries about the Ruby Ridge incident titled Ruby Ridge, An American Tragedy aired on May 19 and 21, 1996. It was based on the book Every Knee Shall Bow by journalist Jess Walter. It starred Laura Dern as Vicki, Kirsten Dunst as Sarah, and Randy Quaid as Randy Weaver, and Bill Gunton as Bo Greitz. Later that year, the television series was adapted into a full-length TV movie, The Siege at Ruby Ridge. The documentary Ruby Ridge was released by Reality Productions Group for the Learning Channel television in 2000. The documentary includes interviews with Randy and Rachel Weaver, FBI Site Commander Eugene Glenn, hostage rescue team negotiator Fred Lansley, civilian negotiators Bo Greitz, and Jackie Brown. Randy Weaver died on May 11, 2022, aged 74, after a month-long illness. Most people around the world had never heard of the Branch Davidians led by the controversial, self-proclaimed prophet David Koresh until the beginning of a 51-day siege at their 77-acre Mount Carmel compound in Waco, Texas, where 130 members had been residing. The Branch Davidians were an offshoot of another extreme Christian religious group called Shepherd's Rod, which was somewhat connected to the Seventh-day Adventists. Who was David Koresh? Who were the Branch Davidians? What caused the long siege resulting in so many deaths?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
The man known as David Koresh was born Vernon Wayne Howell in Houston, Texas in 1959. His mother was 15 years old when she gave birth to him, and Koresh's grandparents ended up raising him. Other students teased him for being dyslexic and gave him the nickname Mr. Retardo. Koresh, as he grew, was lauded for his extensive knowledge of the Bible, and he believed he could speak directly to God and prophesied about the second coming of Christ. He also gave prophecies regarding the end of the world. Federal authorities, post event claimed that he was successfully converting more than 100 people and then convinced them to live in his secluded compound near Waco. His fame within the cult was assured following his time preaching his version of prophetic Christianity throughout the U.S., Israel, Australia, and Great Britain. Koresh was obsessed with rock and roll. In fact, when he was in his early 20s, he moved to Hollywood with hopes of becoming a rock star. When it didn't pan out, he moved to Waco and changed his name and reportedly began trying to attract groupies of a different kind. He had even produced t-shirts that read David Koresh, God Rocks, and continued playing in Christian bands throughout his life. His music is still available online. Koresh joined the Branch Davidians when he was 22 years old and soon became enmeshed in an affair with the group's president, Lois Roden, who was then in her 60s. Her son, George Roden, had been openly opposed to Koresh's relationship with his mother, Lois, and had apparently stated that, quote, he was destined to father a child with her, in essence breeding a new line of messiahs. After Lois died in 1987, Koresh tried to take control of the Branch Davidians and engaged in a power struggle against her son, George, who felt Koresh had brainwashed his mother. During this fight, the tension escalated and Roden was shot in the chest and hands. Koresh was tried for attempted murder, but after a mistrial, he was released. Those charges notwithstanding, due to tip-offs and known gun sales records, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms believed the community had nearly 250 weapons, including semi-automatic rifles, assault rifles, shotguns, revolvers, pistols, and hundreds of grenades. The ATF wanted a search warrant on the suspicion that the Branch Davidians were modifying guns to have illegal automatic fire capability using AR-15 upper and M16 lower receivers. Former Branch Davidian Mark Brolt claimed that Koresh had, quote, M16 lower receiver parts, end quote, which, according to ATF regulations, is constructive possession of an unregistered machine gun, regulated in the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986. The ATF also made the claim that Koresh was operating a methamphetamine lab, which would then bring in the military under the war on drugs, as well as the Drug Enforcement Agency, citing a drug connection based on 1, a recent delivery to the compound of chemicals, instruments, and glassware, 2, a written testimony from a former compound resident alleging Howell had told him that drug trafficking was a desirable way to raise money, 3, several current residents who had prior drug involvement, 4, 2 former residents who were incarcerated for drug trafficking crimes, and 5, National Guard overflights and thermal images showing a hot spot inside the compound, possibly indicating a methamphetamine laboratory. On July 30, 1992, ATF agents David Aguilera and Skinner visited the ranch Davidians gun dealer Henry McMahon, who tried to get them to talk with Koresh on the phone. Koresh offered to let ATF inspect the Branch Davidians' weapons and paperwork and asked to speak with Aguilera, but Aguilera refused to speak with him. The Branch Davidian members were well known locally and supported themselves by trading at gun shows and took care to have the relevant paperwork to ensure that transactions were legal. Branch Davidian Paul Fata was a federal firearms licensed dealer and operated a retail gun business called the Mag Bag. When shipments arrived for Mag Bag, they were signed for by Fata, Steve Schneider, or Koresh. The ATF wanted to arrest Koresh for unlawful possession of destructive devices and search the 77-acre compound, and local law enforcement wanted him for statutory rape. One of the reports stated that, in addition to his passions for Armageddon and sex, according to the Los Angeles Times, he had multiple underage wives and was rumored to sexually abuse girls, having sex with children as young as 10 and 11. This was confirmed by survivors after the fact. Koresh was having sex with the underage girls of many of his followers. Some of his followers, disgusted with his personal methods and abuse of young girls, left the compound. It was reported that a few even filed complaints with local law enforcement regarding the child rapes. Texas state law enforcement officials were also involved due to the sex allegations and other charges. The main justification was that in May 1992, Chief Deputy Daniel Weinberg of McLennan County Sheriff's Department called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms regarding his office being contacted by a local UPS representative regarding a report by one of their drivers. The UPS driver reported that a package he was delivering to the Branch Davidian compound had broken open, and he saw at least a half dozen grenades. He also reported that the compound had been receiving packages from an arms dealer for several months. The objective of law enforcement was to search the premises and arrest Koresh for unlawful weapons possession, and a search warrant was issued, and the raid was planned in daylight and was to be rapid in its execution. They planned the raid on March 1st, but decided to move it up a day. On Sunday, February 28, 1993, in response to reports that the Davidians had been stockpiling illegal weapons at the Mount Carmel Center, supposedly in preparation for the end of the world, Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms drug enforcement agents raided the property. That morning of the raid, Paul Fatta and his son Kalani were already gone and on their way to a gun show in Austin. However, all surprise was lost when a KWTX TV reporter who was tipped off about the raid asked for directions from a U.S. postal mail carrier. Ironically, as luck would have it, the mail carrier was the brother-in-law of David Koresh. In a short time, the group's members were fully armed and prepared. An intense gunfight erupted, resulting in the deaths of 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians. The federal agents were attempting to arrest their leader, David Koresh, in the raid on the group's complex when they began to exchange heavy gunfire at the site. Officials said the Branch Davidians opened fire on the ATF agents first, which surviving members of the religious community have always denied. It's still not clear who fired the first shot. The Branch Davidian survivors claimed that the first shots came from the ATF agents outside. One reason may have been due to the accidental discharge of a weapon by an ATF agent, causing the ATF to respond with automatic weapons. Other reports claim the first shots were fired by the ATF to kill the dogs in the Branch Davidian kennel. 3 helicopters of the Army National Guard were brought in and all took incoming fire. During the first shots, Koresh was wounded, shot in the hand and the stomach. Within a minute of the raid start, Branch Davidian Wayne Martin called emergency services, pleading for them to stop shooting. Martin asked for a ceasefire, and audio tapes record him saying, quote, "Here they come again. That's them shooting. That's not us." When the first gunfight ended, there were 10 casualties in total, 6 law enforcement and 4 Davidians. By the end of the shootout, 4 agents with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and 6 Branch Davidians were confirmed dead. The remaining 62 adults and 21 children who refused to leave the compound began their standoff with the government. The compound was soon surrounded by armored vehicles and more than 600 federal agents. The standoff ended when a fire engulfed the complex on April 19, 1993. Only 9 people inside survived what became known as the Waco Massacre. ATF agents had used ladders to reach the roof, hoping to enter the arms cache on the east side of the building. Others approached from the west side of the roof. 1 agent was killed and another wounded, while a 3rd agent made it over the peak of the roof, joining other agents trying to enter the armory. The window was smashed, a flashbang stun grenade was thrown in, and 3 agents entered the armory. When the last man tried to follow them, bullets came through the wall, wounding him, but he was able to reach the ladder and slide to safety. 1 agent fired his shotgun until he was hit in the head by return fire and killed. The first group of 3 agents reached the armory and then came under fire, killing 1 Davidian, with 2 of their men being wounded, with the 3rd covering their escape, and he fell off the roof but was not seriously injured, but another agent covering their escape was killed. The firefight began losing momentum in less than an hour as the agents ran out of ammunition. Agents Steve Willis, Robert Williams, Todd McKeon, and Conway Charles LeBleu were dead. The 5 Branch Davidians killed in the raid were Winston Blake, Peter Gent, Peter Hipson, Perry Jones, Michael Schroeder, and J. Dean Wendell. 2 were killed by fellow Branch Davidians after being badly wounded. Due to the deaths, the FBI took command of placing Jeff Gemar, head of the Bureau's San Antonio field office, in charge of the siege as site commander. The FBI hostage rescue team was headed by Commander Richard Rogers, who had previously been highly criticized for his actions during the Ruby Ridge incident. At the beginning, Koresh had telephone contact with local news media, and he gave phone interviews. The FBI cut his communication to the outside world. For the next 51 days, communication with those inside was conducted solely by 25 FBI negotiators. However, Koresh was always in direct contact with the FBI negotiators who, during a total of 754 phone calls, were trying to encourage him to turn himself in. The FBI had a video recorder delivered to Koresh, and on it, he introduced his children and his wives, including several minors who claimed to have had babies fathered by Koresh. It was believed that Koresh had fathered perhaps 14 of the children with underage girls who stayed with him in the compound. Several Branch Davidians also made statements in the video. On Monday, March 8th, the Branch Davidians sent the videotape back to show the FBI that there were no hostages. All parties were there of their own free will. Outside the compound on April 1st, 9 Bradley fighting vehicles carrying M651 CS tear gas grenades and ferret rounds and 5 M728 combat engineer vehicles obtained from the U.S. Army began patrolling. It was known that the Davidians had at least 2 50 caliber machine guns, hence the AFBs being bought up. They destroyed perimeter fencing and outer buildings and crushed cars belonging to the Davidians and repeatedly drove over the grave of Branch Davidian Peter Gent, despite protests by the Branch Davidians and even the negotiators. During this time, negotiators arranged for the release of 35 Branch Davidians, including 21 children. But on April 19th, in an attempt to lure Koresh and his followers out, agents took decisive action that critics later called extreme and unwarranted. The reason was that Attorney General Janet Reno, newly appointed and with the Ruby Ridge disaster fresh in her mind, wanted an end to the standoff. This was when the FBI was brought in. ATF agents claimed that they heard shots coming from within the compound. Due to the children who had been physically and sexually abused long before the standoff, this was considered justification for launching tear gas attacks to force the Branch Davidians out of the compound. The FBI made that request to both President Bill Clinton and to Attorney General Janet Reno, who gave the green light. The cost was about $1 million a week, and Reno had had enough. She ordered the assault. The building was then rammed with tanks, and the agents launched a tear gas assault with more flashbang grenades. After more than 6 hours, no Branch Davidians had left the building, sheltering inside in an underground concrete block room called the bunker within the building, or they were using gas masks. Soon after that, the building caught fire at 3 different locations, although the actual cause of the fires are still a subject of hot debate, and during the fire, 76 Branch Davidians, including 28 children, died. Most of the dead had fatal gunshot wounds to the head, chest, and face, authorities said, and Koresh had a gunshot wound in the middle of his forehead. Among those killed were a 13-year-old boy who was fatally stabbed in the chest and 2 other minors who suffered fatal blows to the head, according to the FBI. It was sometime during the fire that the 33-year-old Koresh had died of a gunshot wound to the middle of his forehead. It remains unknown whether he killed himself or was shot by someone else. But that's not the only unanswered question when it comes to the infamous siege. Here are some other debates around and other little-known facts about the Waco Siege and David Koresh. The questions were who shot first and who was responsible for the fire. David Thibodeau, one of only 9 Branch Davidian members to survive the fire, told Time magazine that he believed the dead Branch Davidians were shot by the FBI. Thibodeau said he firmly believed that nobody inside the complex would have started the flames. However, the FBI claimed that no law enforcement officer had fired a single bullet since the initial shootout, which may in fact be true. Thibodeau also said it's also likely some of the Branch Davidians may have shot each other to prevent a slower, more painful death in the fire. Spin magazine journalist Darcy Steinke who covered the standoff as it was happening, later told the magazine, quote, "She felt the government was to blame for how things went down. I think it was the government's fault. Koresh jogged every day at the same time on the same route before the siege. And so, if they wanted to take him, they could have just pulled up in a police car and arrested him. It was insane to come to the compound of an obviously unstable person who you know has a ton of weapons with heavily armed ATF agents." The Justice Department stated that the 51-day standoff at the Branch Davidian compound was unprecedented in the annals of American law enforcement. Never before have so many heavily armed and totally committed individuals barricaded themselves in a fortified compound in a direct challenge to lawful federal warrants. It was also believed the government wasn't fully informed about Koresh and his followers before they decided to confront the group so aggressively. The Davidians were exactly what you'd expect them to be if you knew their theology and had done any research beforehand, but if the FBI had known what they were all about before they started, they would have never done the raid. It was a botched deal. The FBI has since reformed its tactical methods when dealing with standoffs. The final Justice Department report found that negotiators criticized the tactical commanders for undercutting negotiations. David Koresh and the majority of his followers perished, although his prophecy was unfulfilled. The sun didn't blacken, nor the moon turn red. The world did come to an end, just as their prophet had promised, stated Times' Nancy Gibbs as she wrote that article. The group didn't completely die out after the Waco debacle. 9 Davidians escaped the fire, and the group still hasn't completely dissolved. A new group formed called Branch, the Lord Our Righteousness, created a new compound in the old Waco space. They have a new leader. Some Davidians were still meeting regularly for Bible study in 2013, and some believed Koresh might return from the dead to lead them again. David came to give us a message and a hope, one survivor, Sheila Martin, said, and told People magazine, "We hope to see him again. Our regret is only that we didn't serve God better." It was proven that the Davidians were well stocked with small arms numbering 305 firearms, including semi-automatic AK-47s and AR-15s, with some 46 semi-automatic firearms modified to fire in fully automatic mode, and many shotguns, revolvers, pistols, 2 HK SP-89s, and 2 M11s. The Texas Rangers reported that there were at least 16 AR-15 rifles, 2 AR-15 lower receivers modified to fire in fully automatic mode, 39 auto-sear devices used to convert semi-automatic weapons to automatic weapons fire, parts for fully automatic AK-47 and M16 rifles, 30-round magazines, and 100-round M16 and AK-47 magazines and ammunition pouches. They located grenade launchers, parts, flare launchers, gas masks, and chemical warfare suits, night vision equipment, hundreds of practice hand grenade hulls and components, including more than 200 inert M31 practice rifle grenades, more than 100 modified M21 practice hand grenade bodies, 250 caliber machine guns, 219 grenade safety pins, and 243 grenade safety levers found after the fire, Kevlar helmets and bulletproof vests, 88 lower receivers for the AR-15 rifle, and approximately 21 sound suppressors, or silencers. The Davidians who surrendered were charged, and after a 2-month trial, were convicted on most counts, but the jury acquitted 4 of the Branch Davidians on all charges. Additionally, the jury acquitted all the Branch Davidians on the murder-related charges, but convicted 5 of them on lesser charges, including aiding and abetting the voluntary manslaughter of federal agents. 8 Branch Davidians were convicted on firearms charges. Those who were convicted and received sentences of up to 40 years were Kevin A. Whitecliff, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime; Jaime Castillo, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime; Paul Gordon Fata, convicted of conspiracy to possess machine guns and aiding Branch Davidian leader David Koresh in possessing machine guns; Renos Lenny Avram, a British national, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime; Graham Leonard Craddock, an Australian, convicted of possessing a grenade and using or possessing a firearm during a crime. Brad Eugene Branch, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime. Livingstone Fagan, a British national, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime. Ruth Riddle, a Canadian, convicted of using or carrying a weapon during a crime. Catherine Schroeder, sentenced to 3 years after pleading guilty to a reduced charge of forcibly resisting arrest. 6 of these people appealed, and the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit vacated the sentences for the use of machine guns, determining that the district court had made no finding that they had actively employed the weapons, but left the remaining verdicts intact. The appeals went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, who reversed the decision, holding that the term machine gun in the relevant statute created an element of the offense to be determined by a jury rather than a sentencing factor to be determined by a judge, as had happened in the trial. About 100 relatives of those killed or wounded and survivors filed lawsuits against Texas and the federal government, but all of these cases were eventually dismissed.
During the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta, Georgia, 3 pipe bombs exploded, killing 2 people and injuring 111 on July 27th. Those killed were a woman named Alice Hawthorne, who died shortly after the blast when one of the bomb's nails penetrated her skull. The other was a Turkish cameraman named Melih Unzanyal, who died of a heart attack while rushing to the scene. The world was stunned. Immediately, state, local, and federal authorities arrived and started their investigations, collecting bomb debris, interviewing potential witnesses, gathering statements, and reviewing surveillance camera footage to identify the bomber. The media was in a panic for a good story, and law enforcement authorities were under incredible pressure to solve the case. But mistakes were made. Who was Eric Rudolph? Why did he become a domestic terrorist? How many bombings was he responsible for? How did he justify his actions? How long did it take to catch him, and why? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Eric Robert Rudolph was born on September 19, 1966 in Merritt Island, Florida, to pacifist parents who first met protesting the Vietnam War. They were a devout Christian family, and they suffered the loss of the father, who died of cancer in 1981 when Rudolph was 15 years old. Rudolph blamed God and the government since they didn't approve an experimental drug that could have saved his father's life. After the death, his mother moved the family to Nantahala, North Carolina, where Rudolph's radicalization arguably began. Rudolph spent a lot of time with his neighbor Thomas Wayne Branham, who detested the government and always kept an arsenal of weapons on hand, which was soon raided by the ATF when Rudolph was 17. By then, Rudolph had already dropped out of high school and was under Branham's influence, who convinced Rudolph to leave, and he spent 4 months with an anti-Semitic, racist, and homophobic preacher in Missouri. Rudolph returned to North Carolina to get his GED and attend college, but he dropped out to join the U.S. Army. Rudolph was stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky with the 101st Airborne Division, as was your humble narrator, and received explosives training, but he was discharged for marijuana use in 1989. Afterward, he returned to Nantahala and worked as a carpenter while becoming increasingly paranoid about the government. Rudolph spent several years studying various types of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and anti-gay groups, mostly Christian identity, a movement whose most fundamental teaching pivots on the idea that Anglo-Saxons are the direct descendants of the lost tribes of Israel and thus are the true chosen people of God, in essence a very distorted view of Christianity. In 1996, at age 29, Rudolph began using the aliases Bob Randolph and Bob Rudolph. It was at this time he began planning to bomb the Summer Olympics. As he said in his own words, the purpose of this attack was to confound, anger, and embarrass the Washington government in the eyes of the world for its abominable sanctioning of abortion on demand. Rudolph wore jeans and a blue short-sleeved shirt and carried a backpack containing 3 pipe bombs filled with gunpowder and nails, and placed them under a bench, then setting an alarm for 55 minutes and left. Then he made a 911 call from a nearby payphone, stating, "There is a bomb in Centennial Park. You have 30 minutes." The 2 explosions went off, and following the previous explosion, security guard Richard Jewell had already noticed a suspicious bag and helped clear the immediate area of bystanders, and then flagged down Tom Davis of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, also working security that night. Davis immediately agreed that the bag was suspicious. After the bomb team confirmed their worst fears, Jewell and others ordered everyone in the area to evacuate. Soon the bag exploded at 1:25 a.m. and Jewell recalled what happened. "It knocked me forward and I fell down on my hands and knees. As I pushed myself back up, I looked to my right because that's where the blast came from. Those troopers that had been lined up with those benches were flying through the air. It had knocked them that far." Rudolph fled the scene, but witnesses described what would later turn out to be his pickup truck leave just before the last explosion. And then another major horror arose. Jewell was initially hailed as a hero for his quick thinking and saving lives, but he was soon viewed with suspicion, and then he was falsely accused by the law enforcement agencies and the media of plotting the attack himself to gain notoriety. Later, Jewell sued the media outlets and finally won several awards. And for example, the settlement with NBC was reportedly $500,000. The settlement with CNN was never disclosed, but the payment went to his mother for the harassment she endured. Within days, investigators questioned Jewell, searched the apartment he shared with his mother, and turned his apartment complex into the focal point of media attention. The American media and even law enforcement, desperate to have a suspect, accused an innocent man for 88 days, calling him the prime suspect. He lost his job and was harassed by the public who believed the false narrative. He even received death threats. Even after passing a polygraph test, Jewell lamented that his name was ruined. When Jewell was eventually cleared as a suspect and filed a lawsuit against the publisher of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and Piedmont College, who employed him and fired him. Richard Jewell died in 2007 of natural causes, but his name was cleared. But Eric Rudolph was not finished, because while on the run he bombed an Atlanta abortion clinic, injuring 7 people, and an Atlanta abortion clinic was bombed again with no casualties. A lesbian nightclub was bombed, injuring 4 people. He bombed another abortion clinic in Birmingham, Alabama on January 29, 1998, which killed 35-year-old off-duty police officer Robert Sanderson. On January 29, 1998, the FBI amassed enough evidence to identify him, but by that point, the Atlanta bomber had already vanished into the Appalachian wilderness, where the FBI spent 5 years and $24 million trying to find him. The police had connected the dots since the night of the bombing, and that resulted in a federal warrant for his arrest being issued on February 14, 1998. But Rudolph's brother Daniel felt his family was being unfairly persecuted, not knowing what his brother had done, and bizarrely opted to cut his own left hand off with a circular saw in protest. The FBI placed Rudolph on their 10 most wanted list in May with a $1 million reward, and on October 14, 1998, Rudolph was formally charged with all 4 bombings. The manhunt was still ongoing and included bloodhounds, aircraft, motion and heat sensors, and hundreds of interviews with potential witnesses and informants. According to the FBI report, before Rudolph vanished, he was last seen at the Nantahala home of a health food store owner named George Nordman on July 7, 1998. Rudolph was there to ask for supplies and food. Nordman initially agreed to help him, but later changed his mind and reported him a few days later, knowing he was wanted. But to catch Rudolph required a new type of collaboration between local law enforcement and the federal bureaus like the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. This began in earnest after the attacks on September 11, 2001, when federal officials started to share information with local law enforcement about extremist ideology and the whereabouts and behaviors of people they were looking for. The search for Rudolph was one example of why this collaboration was needed. Law enforcement believed that Rudolph was still in the area, hiding out in the Nantahala National Forest as a survivalist, but where exactly would he set up camp was anyone's guess. The public pressure on the feds was mounting, and they believed that he was receiving aid from the locals because they did not believe he could survive in the woods alone. So the FBI started applying pressure, increasing the tension. Assistant Police Chief Chris West said during an interview that the FBI is keeping it pretty hush. We could have given them help with the terrain, showing them spots they needed to check out, caves, caverns, old mountain homes, but they haven't even asked us. Local carpenter Doug Franklin recalled his impression of the police, quote, "It seemed to me like a farce more than anything else. They had coffee pots set up on the side of the road, and you'd see them sitting or standing there, and their uniforms were perfectly clean. No dirt on it, just a clean uniform. So that told me that they hadn't been very far out in the woods looking for him." Most of the locals and even local police openly wondered how much federal authorities were actually doing to find Rudolph, especially since many of them were unfamiliar with the local wilderness. Some even suggested that the FBI was really only there for publicity and training exercises. As time passed, many people believed that Rudolph had died at some point while he was on the run. This was because hundreds of agents combed the Nantahala National Forest, but by 2000, the manhunt had been scaled back, and by 2002, the search was essentially comprised of just a dozen agents. Rudolph had been living rough and resorted to taking food from trash dumpsters behind restaurants and hotels. That was when on May 31st, 2003, a 21-year-old police rookie named Jeffrey Postel just happened to be driving by and saw what he thought was a homeless vagrant in a trash dumpster. When Postel arrested him, Rudolph identified himself as Jerry Wilson. He did not know that he had captured Eric Rudolph. It was only when they arrived at the station other cops looked at Rudolph's wanted poster and put two and two together. Rudolph then told them, "I'm Eric Robert Rudolph, and you've got me." The nation was shocked to hear that Rudolph had been caught, as his story had been relegated to the back pages of every newspaper and TV and radio news feed, which hardly ever mentioned him. He just fell off the news radar. However, the authorities wanted to know many things, such as how did he survive in the woods for so long? Did he have help? According to Rudolph, he spent time between a summer camp and a winter camp in different areas of the wilderness, hunting locally for food, or stole what he needed from homes and slept on the ground most nights. There was never any evidence of any assistance given to Rudolph, but law enforcement and even some locals think that he must have had at least one person helping him, which they believe would explain how he survived. After 2 years in custody, Rudolph agreed to a plea bargain. He would plead guilty to all 4 bombings and waive his appeals. In exchange, he would avoid the death penalty for the deaths that were a result of his bombings. And on July 18th, Rudolph was given 4 life sentences in 2005. Following his agreement 5 days later, Eric Rudolph explained in a statement that his bombings were meant to urge the government to outlaw abortions and to resist giving gay people more rights. Today, Eric Rudolph is still serving his life sentence at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, where he will most likely die. Rudolph wrote a book in prison titled Between the Lines of Drift, The Memoirs of a Militant, which was published with help from his brother in February 2013. In April 2013, the U.S. Attorney General seized $200 from the sales of the book, which was not selling well, to help pay off the $1 million that Rudolph owed in restitution to the state of Alabama. The book has since been republished and has been made available through the Army of God website. Rudolph has said, "The truth is, I am a Christian." Well, Rudolph remained unremorseful for his actions and in a statement before the court called his acts against abortion providers a moral duty. He said, "As I go to a prison cell for a lifetime, I know that I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith." In his work, White Lies, Abortion, Eugenics, and Racism, Rudolph expresses his admirations towards Catholicism. But any Christian, regardless of denomination, knows that Eric Rudolph's interpretation of religion is a very distorted reality. Espionage is often called the world's second oldest profession, but few have practiced it with such devastating success as Robert Hanssen. While governments rely on spies to gather secrets, some of those insiders turn against their own country. Hanssen wasn't a foreign infiltrator or an ideological radical. He was an insider, an FBI special agent who sold out the very agency sworn to protect America's secrets. Robert Hanssen was one of the most damaging spies in U.S. history. A senior FBI agent turned traitor, Hanssen sold secrets to the Soviet Union and later Russia for over 2 decades, compromising U.S. intelligence operations and putting countless lives at risk. His betrayal was so deep it prompted an overhaul of American counterintelligence practices. Who was Robert Hanssen? What was his background? What did he do? Why did he do it? What was the end result? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Robert Philip Hanssen was born on April 18, 1944 in Chicago, Illinois, and had a domineering father who was a Chicago police officer. Hanssen graduated from William Howard Taft High School in 1962 and attended Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, graduating with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry in 1966. Hanssen applied to the National Security Agency as a cryptography specialist after graduation, but was turned down due to budget constraints. He then enrolled in dental school at Northwestern University, but he switched his focus to business after 3 years. He married Bernadette Bonnie Walk in 1968. Hanssen received an MBA in Accounting and Information Systems in 1971 and took a job with an accounting firm. But after 1 year, he resigned and joined the Chicago Police Department as an internal affairs investigator specializing in forensic accounting. In January 1976, Hanssen left the Chicago Police to join the Federal Bureau of Investigation, moving into highly sensitive national security roles as a counterintelligence and cybersecurity specialist. Hanssen was assigned to the FBI's field office in Gary, Indiana. In 1978, he and his growing family of 3 and eventually 6 children relocated to New York City. The next year, Hanssen was transferred to counterintelligence and given the task of compiling a database of Soviet intelligence for the FBI. In 1979, Hanssen approached Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, on his own initiative. His motive was not ideology. He was a Catholic and political conservative, but greed, ego, and resentment of being undervalued in the Bureau motivated him. He stopped his spying briefly in early 1981 after his wife allegedly caught him and made him confess to a priest. The priest advised him to stop and donate the money he'd received to charity. Hanssen agreed, but it didn't last. He restarted his espionage activities in 1985 and continued until 1991, when he ended communications during the collapse of the Soviet Union, fearing he would be exposed. But in 1985, Hanssen was again transferred to the FBI's field office in New York City, where he continued to work in counterintelligence against the Soviets. After the transfer, while on a business visit back to Washington, he resumed his espionage career, this time with the KGB and later his successor, the SVR, Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and operated under the alias Ramon Garcia. His Soviet handlers never knew his real name to ensure his security, which allowed him to remain unknown to U.S. intelligence for 2 decades. From the U.S. investigation file, Hanssen sent an anonymous letter to the KGB offering his services and asking for $100,000 in cash, equivalent to about $290,000 in 2024. In the letter, he gave the names of 3 KGB agents secretly working for the FBI: Boris Yushin, Valery Martinov, and Sergei Motorin. Hanssen was unaware that Aldrich Ames of the CIA had already exposed all three agents earlier that year. Hanssen had simply corroborated the information. Yuzhin had returned to Moscow in 1982 and had been interrogated by the KGB because he had lost a concealed camera in the Soviet consulate in San Francisco, but he was not arrested for espionage until exposed by both Ames and Hanssen. Martinov and Motorin were both recalled to Moscow and arrested, charged, tried, and convicted of espionage against the Soviet government. Martinov and Motorin were both executed via gunshot to the back of the head, while Yuzhin was imprisoned for 6 years before he was released by a general amnesty granted to political prisoners, and he subsequently immigrated to the United States. Because the FBI blamed Aldrich Ames and the CIA for the leaks, as he was spying for the Soviets at the same time as Hanssen, both men provided the Soviets with many aspects of the U.S. counterintelligence program. Following Ames's arrest, the problem was believed to have been solved, and Hanssen was neither suspected nor investigated, which gave him a clear field to betray his country without scrutiny. For his services, the Soviets and later Russian governments gave him over $1.4 million in cash, bank transfers, Rolex watches, and diamonds. He never met his handlers face-to-face, using dead drops to communicate. Hanssen operated without directly identifying himself, and being a cybersecurity and counterintelligence expert, he knew how to evade surveillance. By that time, Hanssen sold about 6,000 classified documents to the KGB that detailed U.S. and NATO strategies in the event of nuclear war, to include developments in military weapons and technologies. Hanssen also revealed the existence of a top-secret FBI surveillance tunnel under the Soviet embassy in D.C., and handed over classified surveillance techniques, nuclear war plans, and information on continuity of government plans, as well as a complete list of American double agents. For that information, Hanssen received a $55,000 payment the following month, in September 1989. These pieces were falling into place. Both the FBI and CIA realized by the 1990s that there was a mole somewhere, although they were unsure if it was only one or other agencies, and to which agency the mole or moles worked in, or both. To make things even worse, CIA mole Aldrich Ames, unknown to Hanssen, also gave information on Dmitry Polyakov, a major general in the Soviet GRU, who spied for the CIA and the FBI during the Cold War. He was exposed by Ames in 1985, and later Hanssen's information corroborated Ames's report. Polyakov was arrested in 1986 and executed by the KGB in 1988. Ames was officially blamed for giving Polyakov's name to the Soviets, while Hanssen's role in also exposing Polyakov was not revealed until after his 2001 capture. After Ames's arrest in 1994, some of these intelligence breaches remained unsolved, and the search for another spy continued, and Hanssen began taking extra precautions. However, despite Ames being caught, the situation seemed to get worse in the late 1990s, and suspicions mounted further, especially after more intelligence assets went dark in Russia. Hanssen, being somewhat paranoid, refused to use the dead drop sites that his handler, Viktor Cherkashin, suggested, and instead chose his own. He also designated a code to be used when dates were exchanged. 6 was to be added to the month, day, and time of a designated drop, so that, for example, a drop scheduled for January 6 at 1 p.m. would be written as July 12 at 7 p.m. Following the CIA's method of catching Ames, the FBI themselves launched their own top-secret internal mole hunt. Ironically, Hanssen was to investigate any possible penetrations of the FBI and find the man responsible for exposing Martinov and Motorin. As a result, there was no progression in this investigation. In 1989, Hanssen told the Soviets about the investigation into U.S. State Department employee Felix Bloch, who was suspected of espionage. Hanssen warned the KGB that Bloch was being investigated, causing the KGB to end contact with him abruptly. So, without evidence, Bloch was never charged with a crime, although the State Department later terminated his employment and denied his pension. Hanssen also gave the KGB extensive information about U.S. planning for measurement and signature intelligence, or MASINT, using a variety of electronic means, such as radar, spy satellites, and signal intercepts. The failure of the Block investigation and the FBI's investigation of how the KGB learned that they were investigating Block caused the mole hunt that eventually resulted in Hanssen's arrest. The FBI then divided up various departments, keeping their mole hunt on a need-to-know basis so that even Hanssen himself was unaware of the other tentacles of the investigation. The FBI paid KGB agent Alexander Sherbakov $7 million for a file that disclosed Hanssen's fingerprints and a voice recording and audio tape of a July 21, 1986 conversation between Hanssen and KGB agent Alexander Fefilov. The FBI was unsure if the evidence was real or a plant by the Russians, so they took precautions and set up surveillance and reassigned Hanssen to a fake post with no real access to classified data. Astonishingly, in 1990, Hanssen's brother-in-law, Mark Woke, also an FBI employee, had suggested that the FBI investigate Hanssen because his sister, Hanssen's wife, told him that her sister, Jean Beglis, had found a pile of cash on a dresser in the Hanssen's house. Bonnie had previously told her brother that Hanssen once discussed retiring in communist Poland. Woke also knew that the FBI was hunting for a mole and spoke with his supervisor, but nothing was done. After the fall of the USSR in 1991, Hanssen, perhaps unsure if his activities would be exposed or if he would even have his supplemental income, went to the Russian embassy and offered his services to a GRU agent. He identified himself as Ramon Garcia, but the agent, not in the previous intelligence loop, did not recognize him and drove away, fearing a trap. In 1993, Hanssen hacked into the computer of a fellow FBI agent, Ray Mislock, possibly wanting to learn anything about the mole investigation. He claimed it was to prove the insecurity of the system, and he was believed. In 1994, Hanssen wanted a transfer to the new National Counterintelligence Center, but when told that he would have to take a lie detector test to join, he changed his mind. Earl Edwin Pitts, himself a convicted FBI mole, told the FBI that he suspected Hanssen due to the Mislock computer hack. In fact, Pitts was the second FBI agent to mention Hanssen by name as a possible mole, but again, nothing was done. The FBI and CIA then joined forces in 1994 to find the leak. They created a list of all agents known to have access to cases that were compromised. The FBI's codename for the suspected spy was Graysuit. Some promising suspects were cleared, and the mole hunt found other penetrations, such as CIA officer Harold James Nicholson, who was arrested in 1996. However, still Hanssen was not detected, but he was finally suspected. Since Hanssen had been due to retire, the FBI acted quickly in an effort to catch him red-handed. The former Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterintelligence Division, Deborah Evans Smith, said afterward, "What we wanted to do was get enough evidence to convict him, and the ultimate aim was to catch him in the act." So, to lure Hanssen back to FBI headquarters for closer monitoring, he was given a fake assignment, and Hanssen began working in his new office, complete with hidden cameras and microphones, at FBI headquarters in January 2001. Hanssen suspected something because he wrote a letter to his Russian handler, which the FBI later recovered, stating that he was placed in a dead-end job. Dropping a friend off at the airport on February 18, 2001, Hanssen drove to Virginia's Foxstone Park, where he placed a white tape marker on a park sign to signal his Russian contacts to retrieve a package at the dead drop site. He then followed his usual routine, taking a sealed garbage bag of classified material and taping it to the bottom side of a wooden footbridge over a creek. FBI agents watching then rushed in to arrest Hanssen, who asked, "What took you so long?" The FBI waited 2 more days to see if any of Hanssen's Russian contacts would arrive. No one came, and the United States Justice Department announced Hanssen's arrest on February 20th. Hanssen received 15 life sentences without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to 14 counts of espionage and 1 count of conspiracy to commit espionage, thereby avoiding the death penalty for treason. He was incarcerated at ADX Florence, a federal supermax penitentiary known for housing other high-profile inmates like Al-Qaeda terrorist Zacarias Moussaoui and Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Hanssen died of colon cancer on June 5, 2023. Hanssen operated undetected for over 2 decades, shielded by the compartmentalization of U.S. intelligence agencies and the deep mistrust between them. Neither the FBI nor the CIA could see the full picture, allowing him to slip through the cracks. But in the end, Hanssen had compromised more than 50 top-secret operations and inflicted damage so severe it took many years to fully assess. His betrayal is still considered the worst intelligence failure in FBI history. But in exposing those cracks, Hanssen forced the intelligence community to face its deepest vulnerabilities, working together and to finally start fixing them.
2 years before the Boston Marathon bombing, the FBI sat across from one of the men who would build the bombs. They had received a warning from a foreign intelligence and had evidence that showed his beliefs were hardening and that violence was a real possibility. The FBI interviewed him, checked off the boxes, then they closed the file. On April 15, 2013, the bombs went off. The explosions didn't strike a military target or government building. They tore through families standing behind barricades, waiting for runners to cross the finish line. Children, parents, spectators, with nowhere to move and no warning. Within hours, the country demanded answers. Who did this? Why Boston? And how could something like this happen in plain sight? But there was a more uncomfortable question buried beneath the chaos. What if this attack wasn't a surprise? What if the warning signs weren't missed, but acknowledged and then set aside? Let's try and find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History.
The beginning of the toughest 26 days in Marine Corps history.
With confidence in our armed forces.
36th President of the United States died this afternoon.
Tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev lived in the United States for years before the bombing, after immigrating from Kyrgyzstan with their parents. Kyrgyzstan is a poor, politically unstable former Soviet republic in Central Asia, marked by ethnic tensions, weak institutions, corruption, and heavy Russian influence. The family settled in the Boston area, later becoming naturalized U.S. citizens. The brothers attended school, worked, and moved within ordinary American life. On the surface, there was little that separated them from thousands of other young men growing up in the same communities. However, the brothers were very different in temperament and role. Tamerlan, the older sibling, struggled to find stability. He drifted between jobs, failed to establish a professional boxing career, and grew increasingly isolated. Friends and acquaintances later described the shift in his behavior. He became more rigid in his beliefs and more confrontational in his views. Over time, his Muslim faith moved from personal practice to ideological fixation. Dzhokhar, the younger brother, was quiet and more adaptable. He attended college, socialized easy, and drew less attention. There is little evidence that he drove events. Instead, his path followed his brother's lead. In the years leading up to the attack, Tamerlan's radicalization was shaped by exposure to online jihadist material and extremist sermons, which framed global conflicts as evidence of a civilizational struggle. These narratives promoted violence as both justified and necessary, portraying it as a form of religious obligation rather than criminal behavior. Tamerlan voiced extremist views openly, including confrontations at a local mosque, where he challenged speakers whose interpretation he viewed as insufficiently strict. Family members later acknowledged his increasingly uncompromising beliefs, and his behavior reflected a rejection of American cultural norms in favor of a rigid ideological identity. Djokar's radicalization followed a different pattern. His beliefs developed in proximity to his older brother, shaped by loyalty, influence, and a shared environment. By the time of the attack, extremist ideology was not an emerging concern, but an established feature of the brothers' worldview, particularly for Tamerlan, whose influence defined the trajectory that followed. The first formal warning about Tamerlan did not originate inside the United States. It came from Russian intelligence, which contacted U.S. authorities with specific concerns about his growing alignment with Islamic extremism. Russian officials indicated that Tamerlan had become increasingly radical and warned that his beliefs could translate into violence. This type of intelligence sharing was not unusual. U.S. and Russian security services had a history of limited cooperation on counterterrorism, particularly when it involved Islamist networks that operated across borders. The information reached the FBI, which treated it as credible enough to open an assessment. FBI agents interviewed Tamerlan directly. They also spoke with members of his family. The goal was to evaluate his beliefs, associations, and behavior, to determine whether there was evidence of intent or capability that crossed the threshold for escalation. However, by 2011, federal agencies were operating in the long shadow of 9/11. Years of lawsuits, public backlash, and accusations of profiling had created a counterpressure inside law enforcement. Do not be seen as targeting Muslims or immigrants without absolute proof. That caution hardened into paralysis. The FBI did not misunderstand the threat posed by radical Islamist ideology, but they were operating in an environment where escalating a case involving a Muslim immigrant, absent clear operational evidence, carried career, legal, and political risk. So they retreated. Tamerlan's assessment wasn't closed because the concern wasn't founded. It was closed because the system had been conditional to require near certainty before persistence. In trying to avoid the appearance of prejudice, investigators deferred action until ideology crossed into provable conspiracy. But by then, it was too late. In addition, at the time Tamerlan's assessment was closed, the FBI was led by Robert Mueller. The decision reflected how the Bureau operated under his leadership. During Mueller's tenure, the FBI was repeatedly criticized for moving too slowly, narrowing investigations too early, failing to act decisively when warning signs were present. The anthrax investigation dragged on for years. The Bureau struggled to confront corruption tied to Whitey Bulger, and later, the Trump collusion investigation would draw similar criticism for prolonged restraint and delay, despite ultimately finding no evidence of collusion. In each case, the problem was not a lack of information, it was failure to properly evaluate information. The closure of Tamerlan's assessment followed the same pattern. After the FBI interview concluded, Tamerlan was not placed under active surveillance. His communications were not regularly reviewed. Tamerlan traveled abroad in 2012, spending approximately 6 months in Dagestan and Chechnya, regions associated with Islamist insurgency. That travel did not result in a renewed scrutiny upon his return. His ideological isolation deepened and fixation intensified, yet institutionally he remained a closed file. What followed unfolded entirely outside the boundaries of official attention. The Boston Marathon is held every year on Patriots' Day and has been run continuously since 1897. It is one of the longest-standing annual sporting events in the United States and draws professional runners, qualifying amateurs, and international competitors alike. By the final stretch, Boylston Street becomes the focal point of the entire event. In 2013, nearly 500,000 spectators lined the course, with the densest crowd packed near the finish line. Friends and family gathered just feet from the barriers, waiting for runners to emerge from the last turn. Movement slowed. The space narrowed. All attention fixed forward. As the final wave of runners crossed the line, the street was at its most crowded point and escape paths were limited. That's when the explosions occurred. 2 pressure cooker bombs exploded near the finish line within seconds of each other. The blast tore through the crowds, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. Many of the wounded suffered traumatic amputations and life-altering injuries. Panic spread quickly as emergency responders rushed towards the scene and bystanders attempted to help those closest to the explosions. The attack immediately stood out for its symbolism and scale. It targeted civilians at a public event with no military or political function, echoing tactics associated with jihadist terrorism abroad. Within hours, the bombing was described as the deadliest terrorist attack on U.S. soil since September 11th. The comparison carried weight not only because of the loss of life, because of what it suggested about the vulnerability in everyday spaces. As the city locked down and the search for suspects intensified, surveillance footage released by authorities led to the public identification of the Sarnoff brothers. And the city of Boston entered an unprecedented lockdown as the search intensified. Streets were emptied, public transit was suspended, and residents were ordered to remain indoors while law enforcement pursued the subjects. 3 days after the bombing, on April 18th, the Sarnoff brothers shot and killed MIT police officer Sean Collier while he sat in his patrol vehicle. They then carjacked a civilian, forcing him to withdraw cash from an ATM. During the ordeal, they confessed to the bombing. The hostage escaped, alerting authorities. That night, the manhunt converged Watertown, Massachusetts. What began as a traffic stop in a quiet residential neighborhood turned violent within seconds. Officers moved in on the brothers' vehicles. Gunfire erupted. Improvised explosive devices were thrown into the streets. Neighbors were jolted awake by flashes, blasts, and the sound of automatic fire echoing between the houses. The confrontation spilled into the open. Police closed the distance under fire. Tamerlan was wounded and brought to the ground as officers attempted to secure him. In the chaos, his younger brother forced the vehicle forward, striking Tamerlan as he lay in the street and dragging him away before escaping into the neighborhood. Tamerlan later died from his injuries. Johar vanished into the darkness. By early morning, hundreds of law enforcement officers moved house to house, clearing yards, garages, and sheds. The search stretched for hours. Nothing surfaced. As night approached, the lockdown was lifted. People stepped back outside. The neighborhood began to breathe again. Then, a resident noticed something wrong.
I have a boat in my yard. There's blood all over the inside. There's a person in the boat.
Police were called back. Perimeter snapped shut again. Officers surrounded the property. A helicopter hovered overhead. Thermal imaging detected movement beneath the tarp. Police took positions around the boat. Commands were shouted. For hours, the standoff held. Finally, Johar emerged alive, wounded and exhausted. He was taken into custody as officers secured the scene. With the suspects neutralized, the immediate threat was declared over, and the country moved quickly from fear to resolution. As that transition occurred, federal officials addressed questions about whether the attack could have been prevented. Public statements emphasized the difficulty of predicting a lone actor or small cell terrorism and stressed that no specific, actionable intelligence had indicated an imminent attack. The early assessment of Tamerlan Sarnoff was described as limited in scope and insufficient to justify further investigation at the time. In the weeks that followed, the legal outcome of the Boston Marathon bombing was decisive. Joe Carl was convicted in federal court on multiple counts related to the attack and its aftermath. He was sentenced to death and transferred to ADX Florence, the most restrictive federal prison in the United States. He will spend the remainder of his life in isolation, removed from the public with no possibility of release, absent extraordinary legal intervention. But what remains unresolved lies beyond the prison walls. No comparable reckoning followed for the failures that preceded the attack. The FBI assessment that flagged extremist risk was closed under existing policy, a policy overseen at the time by FBI Director Robert Mueller. The warning was acknowledged, processed, and then filed away. That imbalance defines the lasting consequence of the case. Individuals are punished with certainty and permanence. Institutions are shielded by procedure. When violence follows restraint, responsibility does not rise to the top. It disperses. Accountability dissolves into political language, jurisdictional limits, and after-action reviews that assign fault nowhere in particular. The system did not miss the threat. It declined to pursue it, and no one at the leadership level bore consequences for that decision. When known extremism is acknowledged but treated as insufficient, the consequences are borne by the civilians who never appear in any file. So the final question remains unanswered. When bad decisions lead to catastrophe, who is responsible for the harm that follows? And how is that responsibility measured once the damage is already done? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
In 2014, the nation was watching as a Nevada rancher, his family and friends engaged in an armed standoff against the federal government. It was not a questionable religious group like the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, or a far-right separatist like Randy Weaver in Ruby Ridge, Idaho. It was about a mild-mannered cattle rancher allowing his cattle to feed on federal land, his friends who supported him, and the U.S. Senator who went after him with the full weight of the federal government. This case was a test of where the rights of the American citizen begin and end while defining the boundaries of the federal government under the law. What was the Bundy Ranch standoff? Why was the government so heavy-handed? What was the real reason for the animosity and aggression? How did the situation get resolved? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
The beginning of the toughest 26 days in Marine Corps history.
With confidence in our armed forces.
The 36th President of the United States died this afternoon.
Tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy and his family, including his sons Ryan and Ammon, had a long-standing lease agreement with the Bureau of Land Management, but in 1993, Cliven Bundy stopped paying his federal grazing fees and failed to renew his federal permit. He received delinquency notices, which he ignored, beginning a long-running dispute over cattle grazing on BLM land near Bunkerville, Nevada. His delinquent permit issues escalated, and the federal courts repeatedly ruled against him and treated the cattle as trespass grazing. One of the main reasons for the federal interest was the claim that his cattle threatened habitat protection and endangered species, such as the desert tortoise. Bundy and his supporters called this a fraudulent charge and claimed federal overreach. But was there another reason? Democrat Senator Harry Reid got involved and publicly condemned the Bundys and their neighbors as domestic terrorists due to their always being armed on the properties. Reid then claimed that trespassing violated federal environmental and trespass laws, and he demanded that the cattlemen abandon the area. People wonder why Reid would even get involved in such a small dispute because of violated logic. In 1998, the federal courts began issuing orders against Bundy's unauthorized grazing. Bundy ignored the orders and still refused to pay the fees. The court case moved forward slowly, and in July 2013, a federal judge ordered Bundy to remove trespass cattle from federal land and authorized the government to seize them if he did not comply with the order. In a phone call with BLM agents, Bundy said, "You will not take one single cow that belongs to us. I'm putting you on notice. I will come after you personally and legally. I'll do whatever it takes, and I'll have several hundred to help." But Senator Reid and his cohorts were plotting. China's ENN Energy Group was contracted to build what would be America's largest solar energy complex at a cost of $5 billion. The site chosen, with the guidance of Reid's son, Rory, was in Laughlin, Nevada. Laughlin is in Clark County, where Bundy's ranch is, and where Rory Reid formerly chaired the county commission. At that time, Rory was a lawyer with the firm Lionel Sawyer and Collins and was representing ENN. He later became chief executive officer of the Rogers Foundation. Rumors were being investigated that Reid himself had interest in the land, and he had purchased quite a lot of acreage in the area, but he was not a cattle guy. Some reports and conspiracy claims stated that Reid had an agreement with a Chinese-backed solar panel company, and the project required taking Bundy land and surrounding areas for the deal to go through. Much later, more information would surface. Journalist and blogger Dana Lash stated, "A tortoise isn't the reason why BLM is harassing a 67-year-old rancher. They want his land. The tortoise wasn't of concern when Harry Reid worked with BLM to literally change the boundaries of the tortoise's habitat to accommodate the development of his top donor, Harvey Whitmore. It was a land grab, and the Bundys were in the way." Ironically, Reid's business partner, Whitmore, who headed a billion-dollar real estate company, was found guilty by a federal jury on 3 counts tied to nearly $150,000 illegally funneled to Reid's re-election campaign in 2007. Unfortunately, Cliven Bundy was not a Reid donor. Also, Reid was forced to return campaign money funneled to his granddaughter, who had been one of the Chinese project's most prominent advocates, helping recruit the company during a 2011 trip to China and using his political influence on behalf of the project in Nevada. But he needed more land. In a March 14, 2014 press release, the Bureau of Land Management announced support for the Western Solar Energy Plan, a 2-year planning effort conducted on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Energy to expand domestic energy production and spur development of solar energy on public lands in 6 western states. Also of interest was the fact that the Bureau of Land Management was headed by longtime Reid aide Neil Cornsey, who was a senior policy advisor on land use issues in Reid's office from 2003 to 2011, and was confirmed by the Senate as BLM director on April 8, 2014. Suddenly, federal authorities descended on the cattle ranch. Hardly a coincidence. Finally, on March 27, 2014, BLM temporarily closed a large area in Clark County, Nevada, and on April 5, 2014, began to impound Bundy's cattle. On April 12th, hundreds of supporters showed up, some armed, and confronted federal officers near an Interstate 15 overpass. The armed militia group confronted the federal agents in a tense standoff near the bridge by the Virgin River. Due to the size of the opposition, the feds began releasing the cattle, citing public safety and risk of violence. No shots were fired, but it was tense enough that officials later described serious safety concerns. The cattle were just not worth escalating the problem. During this time, due to the federal officers backing down and the bad public optics, Senator Reid made unsupported and very defamatory statements about Bundy, his sons, and supporters, which only stoked more resentment, fueled the broader political fallout, and accelerated the criminal case against Bundy. The liberal media and Democrat supporters of Reid denied that there was any type of collusion between Reid, his associates, the Chinese company, and the Obama administration to make that deal. However, Records later showed Reed had made land purchases through various corporations, and the stakes were rising. The public was watching. On February 11, 2016, Cliven Bundy, Ammon Bundy, Ryan Bundy, and Ryan Payne, a member of the Montana militia, arrived to support their standoff. They were arrested and charged in and about a federal case tied to the April 2014 standoff. Ammon Bundy told reporters, "I do not believe that there is a jury in this country that will convict. The truth is on our side." The FBI scoured the area and gathered statements from participants and witnesses to try and build an airtight case. On February 17, 2016, after a 21-year legal dispute, the federal court ordered Bundy to pay over $1 million in delinquent raising fees, which he still disputed. A federal grand jury returned an initial indictment against Bundy, Ammon Bundy, Ryan Bundy, and Ryan Payne, but more charges were to come. During the pretrial period, the defense attorneys repeatedly sought full discovery, including disclosure disputes regarding federal surveillance evidence, FBI 302 interview forms, threat assessment material, and tactical operations central logs. During the trial, Ryan Bundy acted as his own attorney and told the jury that it was federal agents who exceeded their authority, triggering the standoff by using snipers to point their guns at me and others, who threw his Aunt Margaret to the ground at a roadblock and used a taser on his brother Ammon Bundy when he blocked the dump truck. Videos of those encounters were widely spread on social media by assorted militia and patriot groups and others. Ryan Bundy told the jury, "When the American people saw that kind of behavior, they were outraged," buttressing his contention that neither he, his father, brother Ammon, or co-defendant Ryan Payne engaged in any kind of conspiracy as alleged in the federal indictment. He said, "These people came and they saved my life," adding a reference to Payne, an Iraq war veteran living in Montana who headed a militia group called Operation Mutual Aid. "Ryan Payne, he saved my life," Ryan Bundy said. "The government will paint him to be a bad man, but the evidence will show otherwise." He also mentioned that his family had ranched there for 141 years. It was later proven that the government failed to provide all the evidence supporting their case to defense attorney Brett Whipple. On December 20, 2017, in federal district court, Chief U.S. District Judge Gloria Navarro declared a mistrial in the Bundy-Payne trial phase amid mounting disclosure issues, specifically because there were 6 Brady Rule violations, cases where prosecutors withhold evidence that could be favorable to the defense. In fact, 3,000 pages of evidence were not turned over to defense attorneys as required by law. After further review, on January 8, 2018, and after the government still failed to comply with the court order, Judge Navarro dismissed all charges with prejudice against the Bundys and Payne, although Payne had previously pled guilty in the previous Oregon case, finding severe Brady violations. Acting U.S. Attorney Stephen W. Meyer and 2 assistant U.S. attorneys who joined him on the prosecution team declined comment. The judge's argument was that the government's failure to disclose evidence represented an egregious and willful miscarriage of justice, stating, "The government conduct in this case was indeed outrageous." However, Navarro was quick to point out that the mistrial had to do with Brady violations by the prosecution, not the defendant's guilt or innocence. She also ruled that the Bundys and Payne could not have a fair trial without full access to the evidence. The news was met with cheers and applause from supporters as Bundy walked out of the U.S. District Courthouse with his wife Carol, a free man for the first time since he was arrested in February 2016 at the Portland International Airport in Oregon, and after his sons were arrested there. What happened was that prosecutors failed to share evidence about the presence of a surveillance camera overlooking the Bundy family ranch, Bureau of Land Management snipers placed just outside the ranch, and threat assessments done by federal officials that suggested the Bundys were not dangerous or capable of violence despite their public statements and statements made in court. This flew in the face of sworn testimony given by the same officers who filed the official reports. In fact, contrary to the actual investigation files, federal prosecutors told the Las Vegas jury that the 4 defendants were at the heart of a massive armed assault conspiracy targeting federal agents who were merely following a court order. Countering that, defense attorney Brett Whipple argued that Cliven Bundy and his supporters were merely involved in a spontaneous reaction to what they considered unconstitutional overreach by agents of the federal government, all armed and targeting them. The federal government had denied that claim despite the family's insistence that they were surrounded by federal guns. They had photographic evidence and witnesses to prove it. Navarro said an agent from the Bureau of Land Management had written of the Bundy family, "They'll probably get in your face, but it won't lead to a shootout." This was not disclosed either. However, 2 others were indicted and convicted, including Gregory Burleson, who said he was hell-bent on killing federal agents at Bunkerville and was sentenced to 68 years in prison. The Bundys and Ryan Payne had all faced charges of conspiring to prevent federal officials from doing their jobs. In this case, that meant Bureau of Land Management officers who were trying to round up Bundy-owned cattle illegally grazing on public land. Payne had pleaded guilty in July 2016 to a felony conspiracy charge before trial in the armed takeover of the Malheur, Oregon Wildlife Refuge. No one was found guilty of conspiracy in the Nevada case. Patrick Donnelly, a Nevada state director for the Center for Biological Diversity, said, "My organization has been following the Bundys and their criminal activity for 10 years. We are absolutely outraged at the incompetence of the prosecutors and the Department of Justice in handling this case. There is clear evidence that laws were violated by the Bundys and the militia that they roused." Cliven Bundy responded, saying,
"When since did the federal government supposed to have an army that comes against we the people? When did that ever happen in America? It happened on Bundy Ranch. They stuck their guns down our throats. And that is definitely not what our founding fathers intended to happen in America. The whole world is looking at us. Why is America acting like this? Why are we allowing the federal government and these bureaucracies to have armies? That's a big question the world wants to know. We're not done with this. If the federal government comes after us again, we will definitely tell them the truth. And that's all we've ever tried to do is tell them the truth. The media needs to wake up and understand."
The government attempted to salvage their case and resurrect the charges, but on August 6, 2020, the Ninth Circuit affirmed dismissal with prejudice in United States v. Bundy, stating that the district court acted within its discretion given the Brady failures, prosecutorial misconduct, and prejudice. As of the 10-year mark in 2024, Bundy cattle were still reported grazing in the area, including around Gold Butte National Monument, and the federal government has been criticized for being reluctant to re-engage after the 2014 escalation and the failed prosecution. The bottom line is that the appellate court agreed that the Brady violations were significant enough to justify the trial court's strongest remedy, dismissal with prejudice, meaning the case cannot be refiled. What also surfaced was that Reed was enriching himself and his family at public and the Bundy family's expense. The BLM wanted Cliven Bundy out of the 600,000-acre Gold Butte area so the agency could use the land for future solar projects, including the one represented by Reed's son, and de facto buffer zones surrounding the solar farms, an energy source favored by the Obama administration. It would have been worth billions of dollars to investors. So, who really won? Did the government overreach? Who was the true villain? The Bundys, their supporters, the federal government, Senator Harry Reid, or all involved? We will let you decide. On January 26, 2016, a convoy of vehicles moved along a remote highway in eastern Oregon, cutting through miles of snow-covered ranchland. Inside one of the trucks was LaVoy Finicum, a rancher who had become one of the most visible figures in the armed occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. State and federal officers had been tracking the group for miles, waiting for the moment to stop them. When the vehicles were finally intercepted, the situation unraveled quickly. Finicum's truck left the road and came to a stop in deep snow as officers surrounded the scene with rifles drawn. Moments later, Finicum stepped out of the vehicle and began moving through the snow. Within seconds, gunfire erupted. What happened in those final moments remains sharply contested. While many argue he was fired upon without provocation, authorities maintain he posed a clear and immediate threat and that officers acted in self-defense. In this episode, we will examine what was reported, what the evidence shows, and what questions still remain unsolved. Who was Robert LaVoy Finicum? What was he doing in Oregon? What actually happened? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
The beginning of the toughest 26 days in Marine Corps history.
With confidence in our armed forces.
36th President of the United States died this afternoon.
Tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
Hello everyone, this is LaVoy Finicum. It's been a while since I've made a video, but I think it's time I made another one.
Robert LaVoy Finicum was born on January 27, 1961 in Kanab, Utah. In 2002, he filed for bankruptcy while living in New Mexico and doing business as Southwest Horse and Trails. He began to operate a foster home for troubled boys near Chino Valley, Arizona in 2008, and, according to tax filings in 2010, Catholic Charities Community Services in Arizona paid the family $115,343 to foster children through 2009. The Bureau of Land Management filed a claim that Finicum was grazing 24 head of cattle on federal land, starting a legal standoff, similar to what the Bundy Ranch had experienced, and see our video on the Bundy Ranch. After the BLM drained one of his water storage tanks on his property to fight a grass fire, he exclaimed,
I don't care if they take half of it and take 50,000 gallons of it. They can't take 100,000 gallons of it. It's mine. It's for my cows. I need it. And they didn't pay for it. They didn't ask for it. They just took it.
He posted his protest on YouTube and asked,
Here, I'm going to post this and tell them to knock it off. They take more than half, they better come and ask me. Quit stealing. It's not theirs.
He concluded,
It'd be really nice if they'd take one of those tankers and come out here and fill it up, replace it. Or how about they just leave it alone?
In June 2015, as he wrote the following in 2 separate letters to the Bureau of Land Management, 3 days apart that read, in part, At this time, I feel compelled to stand up for the Constitution of our land, and in doing so, please do not feel that I am attacking your character. This is not about cows and grass, access, or resources. This is about freedom and defending our Constitution in its original intent. I am severing my association with the BLM. Finicum was referencing Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution, which clearly states that land within the boundaries of any state may only be acquired by the national government if it has the consent of the state legislature, and then it can only acquire it for the placement of military forts, arsenals, dockyards, and other necessary buildings. Private property must be paid for if involving eminent domain issues by the state or federal governments. Although he owned a cattle ranch, Finicum, who had a large family of 11 children, claimed the cows just covered the cost of the ranch. According to BLM, Finicum accrued more than $12,000 in fees and fines in less than 6 months, which he refused to pay. He had openly expressed his displeasure over ranchers being pushed out of grazing lands, such as the Bundy Ranch and the Grand Canyon Passynt. As a result of this impasse, in January 2016, the state removed all Finicum's foster children because of his involvement with the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Finicum went there to support ranchers and farmers like him opposing government encroachment. This was where the real story begins. On January 2, 2016, LaVoy joined Cliven Bundy's sons, Ryan and Ammon, and other protesters at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, taking a stand against the BLM, claiming they were encroaching upon private land, taking water and grazing rights unconstitutionally. Like at the Bundy Ranch, they occupied the area and began a peaceful 41-day standoff with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. The national news took interest in LaVoy and called him the Tarp Man for sitting in a rocking chair outside holding a rifle on his lap. He became famous. On January 26th, Finicum, with Ammon Bundy, Ryan Bundy, Shauna Cox, Ryan Payne, Victoria Sharp, and Brian Cavalier, left the refuge to speak at a senior center in John Day, Grant County. They left in 2 vehicles. Finicum drove his white Dodge pickup truck while the others followed in a Jeep. Law enforcement was alerted to their departure and set up a roadblock on Oregon Highway 395 in Harney County. LaVoy had been in constant contact with Sheriff Glenn Palmer, who was kept out of the federal standoff and not even informed due to his public support of the ranchers. Approaching the first roadblock, Finicum drove away, and a shot was fired that hit his driver's side view mirror. And while trying to avoid a spike strip, Finicum braked and swerved, crashing into a snowbank, trying to bypass the second roadblock. Bullets were fired at Finicum's vehicle again before he could stop. Oregon Highway Patrolman Casey Cotting fired on LaVoy's truck before it ever stopped. What actually happened was that 2 shots were fired by FBI agent Joseph Astorita after LaVoy jumped from the vehicle. 1 shot struck the truck roof and the other went wide. A bullet hit the truck ceiling as he exited the vehicle with hands raised. Finicum exited the truck, and according to the official narrative, he ignored repeated commands by a trooper who had holstered his firearm, approached Finicum with a non-lethal Taser X2 to get on the ground. Finicum reportedly said,
"You back down or you kill me now. Go ahead, put the bullet through me. I don't care.
Where's Ryan?
I'm going to go meet the sheriff. You do as you damn well please."
Finicum was shot in the side by a bullet, and his reaching around to touch the wound was the pretext to claim that he was reaching for a weapon. Coddington then shot Finicum twice in the back, but then the official story released was that Finicum was armed and dangerous, and having a weapon, which he was reaching for when he was shot, justified the shooting. The report said that he was reaching into his jacket, where officers later found a loaded semi-automatic weapon. They said in sworn statements that Finicum was holding his jacket with his left hand and reaching for a pocket with his right. That was when 2 troopers fired a total of 3 times. A 3rd trooper held his fire. Medical assistance was not given to Finicum for about 15 minutes after the shooting, allowing him to bleed out. But the government narrative was in jeopardy. Officials stated that he was reaching for a gun in his pocket when he was shot. Another version was that a weapon was seen. The FBI said that a loaded handgun was found in Finicum's pocket and identified as a Ruger 9mm SR9 handgun, a gift from his stepson. But there was a problem. Passenger Shauna Cox captured the entire event on her cell phone. His public autopsy was performed on January 28th, but officials withheld the autopsy report from the press until March 8th. The cause of death was listed as 3 gunshot wounds to the back, abdomen, and chest. If Finicum was pulling a weapon to engage, why did he not face the troopers? Deschutes County Sheriff's Office investigators processed the scene of the shooting. There were 2 known sets of shots fired by the troopers that killed Finicum, and the earlier FBI shots that struck his vehicle, and this was proven when they discovered a bullet that struck the roof of the truck at a different trajectory. After ascertaining the bullet's existence with the cell phone video taken by Shauna Cox, investigators modeled the bullet's trajectory using computers and determined that the bullet was fired from where 2 FBI agents were located. It was determined that an FBI hostage rescue team member fired twice at Finicum but missed him, wounding a 2nd person in his group. The agent, whose identity was originally withheld, was placed under investigation along with 4 other FBI agents who were suspected of attempting to conceal evidence of the gunshots and giving false statements. They told investigators that none of them fired a shot during the incident. As is usual, the cover-up was proof of the crime. During the investigation, the rifle cartridge casings fired by the FBI agents were reported not being present in the evidence collection. But a state trooper later described seeing the 2 casings at the scene where the FBI agents were positioned. The FBI aerial surveillance video shows agents searching the area, then talking together before separating a few moments later. This was when one agent bent over twice to pick up 2 unknown objects, more than likely the rifle cartridge casings. Law enforcement officials began the investigation into the gunshots after watching the full surveillance video and suspecting something was amiss. 2 FBI pickup trucks were searched for the casings, but none were found, while at least 3 troopers were interrogated about their initial processing of the crime scene. On March 8th, officials revealed their findings to the public. The U.S. Department of Justice launched an investigation into the conduct of the agents. Deschutes County Sheriff's Office investigators, along with the district attorneys of Malheur and Harney counties, declared that Finicum's shooting was justified and necessary. But facts can sometimes be ugly things. On April 5th, the cell phone video footage shot by Cox was released.
Stay down, stay down, stay down. Stay down. Stay down.
The official state and local investigation concluded that 2 Oregon State police officers fired the 3 shots that struck and killed Finicum. The same investigation said they also fired 3 earlier shots into the truck as it approached the roadblock. The Harney County District Attorney concluded that the 6 shots were legally justified under Oregon's deadly force standard. FBI agent W. Joseph Astorita was alleged to have fired 2 shots at Finicum's pickup, which were originally denied. One of the shots penetrated the roof of the pickup and exited through a window. The FBI agents were believed to have recovered the ejected empty cartridges, which is evidence tampering. A 5-count indictment was filed against Astorita by the Department of Justice in Portland for making false statements, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. A public defender represented Astorita, and his trial began in Portland in late July 2018. In an amazing turn of events, a federal grand jury found Astorita to be not guilty on all charges on August 10, 2018, despite the overwhelming evidence. Remember, the DOJ could not have another scandal. After all, it was a midterm election year. The government withheld the names of the state troopers from the report until during Astorita's trial, when one witness accidentally identified one of the shooters as Lieutenant Casey Cotting, who was at that time then superintendent. But the problems with the official story would not go away. The OIG said the FBI's handling of the scene created a conflict with crime scene preservation procedures and documented that shell casings from roadway shots were not recovered, while FBI agents had denied firing at all. Now remember the aerial surveillance video and the trooper who saw the cartridges? 8 shots had been fired in total that day. The report states that only 2 shell casings were found at the scene. Also contradicting the official story that Finicum was a danger to the troopers was the Oregon State Medical Examiner's findings as summarized by the district attorney at the March 8, 2016 press conference, where Finicum was shown to be struck by 3 bullets in the torso entering through his back. The investigation said those 3 bullets were matched to the state troopers, primarily Cotter. Once again, the question, if not facing the troopers, 1, how could they know he was reaching for anything? And 2, how could they have seen a weapon? And 3, how could a weapon have been produced if it was still in his pocket, as one report claimed? On May 12th, more than a dozen Arizona politicians wrote a letter to Oregon Governor Kate Brown, in which they asked her to conduct another, more transparent investigation into Finicum's death using all the evidence. But many people remained unsatisfied. On January 26, 2018, Finicum's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit in the United States District Court in Pendleton, Oregon, against the United States government, primarily against the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Oregon State Police, the Bureau of Land Management, the Oregon Governor Kate Brown, Greg Bretzing, former FBI Special Agent in Charge, Astorita, U.S. Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, former U.S. Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, Harney County Sheriff Dave Ward, Harney County Commissioner Stephen Grasty, the Center for Biological Diversity, and additional unnamed officers. The suit sought more than $5 million in damages for Finicum's wife and each of their children and his estate. Kieran Suckling, the executive director of the Center for Biological Diversity, called the suit a bizarre, incoherent, yet nonetheless dangerous attack on free speech. On July 24, 2020, federal magistrate Judge Patricia Sullivan dismissed claims against all defendants except the Oregon State Police.
In August 2021, U.S. District Judge Michael W. Mosman dismissed the family's claims against the Oregon State Police, the former State Police Superintendent Cotter, the state troopers who fired at Finicum, all claims filed against the federal government, the FBI, Harney County, and former Harney County Sheriff Dave Ward. Only the civil rights claim against Governor Kate Brown remained. But this is an amazing turn of events. Given the dangerous assaults and violence exhibited by extremists in the protest of Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street, Antifa, and see our videos on Antifa and Black Lives Matter, which were supported by the Obama administration, these protests led to billions of dollars in property damage and in fact cost lives without any serious prosecutions and even a bailout fund for the domestic terrorist. There isn't any justification for the actions of law enforcement against LaVoy and his fellow protesters, who were in fact protesting peacefully even if they had taken over Malheur. So was the shooting of Finicum justified, or was it a crime? Was there a political cover-up? We let you decide.
But dadgummit, it's got to stop. It's got to stop. BLM, here I am. You want to pick on somebody? Come pick on me. My cows are out here. You tell me you got to get them off. I'm not taking them off. You know, you want to play those antics with other people, harass them, destroy their lives? Well, here I am. You come pick on me. Come on, pick on me. And I'm not going anywhere. By darn, it's time somebody stands up and tells you to go fly a kite. Well, I'm kind of upset, as you can tell. Got a lot to do before I go home and get some dinner tonight, so we'll catch you later. Bye.
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or show ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.